Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where alarm clocks don't exist, but somehow you still wake up exhausted. Picture this. No electricity, no running water, no concept of a weekend, just endless cycles of back-breaking labour punctuated by the occasional feast day where you get to eat slightly better porridge. We're diving into a typical day in a 15th century European village, and honestly, you probably won't survive this. The mortality rate would shock you, the hygiene standards would horrify you, and the sheer monotony would break your modern attention span in about 45 minutes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'm always curious who's winding down in Tokyo versus who's sneaking this during a work commute in Denver. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The rooster crows, not the charming, distant farmyard sound you might imagine from children's books, but a genuinely aggressive screech, maybe 15 feet from where you're sleeping. It's still completely dark outside, that deep, prehistoric darkness that modern humans almost never experience. No streetlights, no phone screens, no digital clock glow, just black. You're lying on a straw-stuffed mattress that smells faintly of mildew and whatever the previous owner died of. The straw pokes through the rough linen, ticking in about 30 places, and you've got a companion sleeping situation that would make modern personal space advocates weep. Depending on your family size, you're sharing this sleeping platform with anywhere from 2 to 7 other people, plus possibly a dog who provides warmth and definitely fleas. Your blanketith. You're lucky enough to have one that's not shared a scratchy wool that hasn't been washed in months. Washing textiles is labour-intensive enough that most peasants only do it a few times a year, so your bedding carries the accumulated must of seasonal sweat, wood smoke, and that general medieval funk that permeated absolutely everything. Church bells ring in the distance. This is the call for lauds, one of the canonical hours that punctuate medieval Christian life, whether you're devout or just trying to sleep. The bells are both a timekeeping system and a reminder that the church structures literally everything about your existence, from when you wake to when you're allowed to get married to where your crops' tides ultimately flow. You fumble in the darkness for your tunic. Its wool of Ruthenian is woolen. It's the same garment you wore yesterday and the day before that and will wear tomorrow. The concept of a wardrobe is hilarious. You own maybe 2 or 3 garments total. The tunic you're reaching for now, possibly a second one for festival days, and some leg wrappings that Europeans haven't quite figured out should be called pants yet. Historians still argue whether the average peasant even owned undergarments, or if that thin tunic was literally everything between you and the elements. The tunic smells like you, like smoke, like earth, like livestock. Medieval people weren't oblivious to odours, but their baseline for acceptable smell was so wildly different from ours that trying to compare the two is almost meaningless. You pull the garment over your head in the dark, navigating by touch and muscle memory. Someone else in the house is stirring. Maybe your father, maybe your brother, maybe your husband. The household structure varies, but the pre-dawn routine doesn't. You hear the soft sounds of other people doing exactly what you're doing, waking in darkness, finding clothes by feel, preparing for another day that will be virtually identical to yesterday and tomorrow and every other day until something dramatic happens, like a war or a plague or your lord deciding he needs extra labour for his new mill. Your feet hit the dirt floor. Yes, dirt. The floor of your cottage is literally just packed earth, maybe with some rushes scattered across it if you're feeling fancy, or if it's a feast day. The rushes are supposed to soak up spills and make things smell better, but mostly they just become a festering biological experiment that you replace every few months when the rot becomes undeniable. There's a dim glow from the central hearth where the fire has been banked overnight. Keeping fire going is one of those medieval tasks that takes constant attention. You can't just flick a lighter or turn a knob. If your fire goes completely out, you either need to borrow embers from a neighbor or, in the worst case, generate new fire through friction, which is genuinely difficult and time-consuming. So you bank the coals at night, covering them with ash to keep them smouldering, and hope they survive until morning. You move toward that faint orange glow, still half asleep, your body protesting the early hour. There's no gentle wake-up time, no snooze button, no lying in bed scrolling through anything. The rooster has crowed, the bells have rung, and daylight is approaching whether you're ready or not. Outside you can hear other sounds now that you're more alert, other roosters answering the first one in a cascading chorus of agricultural alarm clocks, the lowing of a cow who needs milking, the distant bark of someone's dog. The village is waking up, not because anyone wants to, but because survival requires it. You step outside into the pre-dawn chill, and the smell hits you immediately, a complex bouquet of manure, wood smoke, and medieval authenticity that no historical reenactment ever quite captures. The air is crisp, probably around 40 degrees even though it's late spring, and your breath makes little clouds in the darkness. The path to the church is well-worn dirt, carved by generations of feet walking this exact route twice daily minimum. You know every rut, every stone, every puddle that forms when it rains. You're shoe-sick if you even own shoes and aren't just wrapping your feet in leather scraps or going barefoot, depending on the season shuffle along automatically while your brain remains mostly asleep. Other villagers emerge from their cottages like zombies in a very slow, very medieval apocalypse. There's Thomas the baker already smelling of yeast because he started his ovens hours ago. There's Agnes carrying her youngest on her hip because the baby won't stop crying and at least church gives her somewhere to sit down for 20 minutes. There's old William who hasn't missed a service in 30 years, possibly because he's terrified of hell or possibly because it's just routine. At this point, historians still argue whether medieval peasants were genuinely devout or just going through motions enforced by social pressure. The church bell rings again, closer now, more insistent. This is the call for prime, the first daytime service in the cycle of canonical hours that structures medieval Christian life. Prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline a day is divided not by hours and minutes but by prayer services that most peasants attend at least partially or risk being noticed for their absence. The church looms ahead, its stone construction making it the only permanent building in a village of wattle and daub cottages that need constant repair. Even a small parish church represents more wealth in materials and labour than your entire extended family will ever possess. The stone was hauled from somewhere. The timber for the roof came from the Lord's forest. The labour was donated or coerced from peasants who owed work obligations. It's a monument to priorities. When resources are scarce, you build for God first, people second. You push through the wooden door and enter the nave. It's not much warmer inside than outside, but at least you're out of the wind. The interior is dim, lit by a handful of tallow candles that smell like rendered animal fat because that's exactly what they are. Wax candles exist, but they're for the altar and the wealthy. You get smoking, smelly tallow that drips hot grease and barely illuminates the space. The floor is packed dirt, same as your house, though there might be some worn memorial stones near the altar marking where important people were buried. You stand there and no pews yet. That's a Protestant innovation centuries away. Medieval Catholic churches expect you to stand for services or kneel on the cold ground because apparently suffering brings you closer to God. The priest enters from the side chapel wearing his vestments and looking exactly as tired as everyone else. Father Benedicta, Father William, or Father John, because medieval priests had about 4 names, total begins the service in Latin. Every single word is Latin. The entire Mass, every prayer, every response, delivered in a language that absolutely none of you speak or understand. You mumble along with the responses you've memorized phonetically. Dominus vobiscum gets et cum spiritu tuo back, and you have roughly zero idea what either phrase means. It's like that joke about monks who copied manuscripts for centuries, but one letter was wrong, so they'd been chanting celebrate instead of celibate. Except you wouldn't get the joke because you're illiterate and Latin is just holy mouth sounds. The quirky reality that historians love pointing out, some medieval priests barely understood Latin either. If you were a peasant's son who got pushed into the priesthood because your family owed the Lord a tithe son, you might have learned just enough Latin to stumble through services without technically knowing what you were saying. It was possible to be a priest who could recite the Mass but couldn't actually translate it, which is both hilarious and slightly horrifying. The service continues. There's chanting. The priest elevates the host. Everyone kneels. You stay kneeling long enough that your knees start hurting against the packed earth. This is normal. Discomfort during worship is expected, possibly even encouraged. The medieval church isn't big on creature comforts. They're into suffering as spiritual practice. Around you, other villagers display varying degrees of attention. Some people are genuinely praying, eyes closed, lips moving in personal devotion. Others are clearly thinking about their fieldwork or their sick cow or whether they remembered to bank the fire properly before leaving. The baby that Agnes brought is now definitely crying, and she's doing that mother's way thing, trying to keep it quiet. But babies don't care about prime, and its acoustics carry in the stone chamber. The priest burns incense at some point cheap stuff, not the fancy frankincense you hear about in biblical stories, but some local herb mixture that smells like a medieval attempt at air freshening. The smoke curls up toward the timbered ceiling, catching the candlelight, creating that atmospheric effect that medieval churches absolutely nailed. You notice details because you've seen this same service roughly 5,000 times in your life. The crack in the wall plaster behind the altar. The way Father Benedict always rushes the Kyrie because he wants to get to breakfast. The spot where rain leaks through the thatch roof covering the side chapel, leaving a permanent dark stain on the stone. The service ends with a blessing. However, everyone crosses themselves. You file back out into the pre-dawn, which is now showing the first grey hints of actual daylight on the eastern horizon. You've been inside maybe 20 minutes, possibly 30. You're now spiritually prepared for the day, or at least you've fulfilled your religious obligation, and either way, you're free to return home and actually eat something before the real work begins. The walk back to your cottage takes maybe 3 minutes, which is one of the few convenient things about medieval village. Life everything is within stumbling distance. You can literally see every building from every other building, which makes privacy non-existent but does mean your commute is refreshingly short. Inside, someone has already coaxed the fire back to life. Maybe your wife, maybe your mother, maybe your older daughter. Household gender roles are pretty rigid, and fire management is women's work in the morning, at least until you need to haul the heavy logs later. The flames are growing, licking at new kindling, and the smoke curls up toward the hole in the roof that serves as your chimney. Chimneys, as we know, those nice contained flues won't become standard in peasant homes for another couple centuries, so right now you just have a hole in the thatch and you hope most of the smoke finds it. Your eyes are already watering. Medieval houses are chronically smoky, which is terrible for respiratory health, but does discourage insects and helps cure the meat hanging from the rafters. Everything smells like wood smoke all the time. Your clothes, your hair, your skin, even your food picks up that background char flavor. Modern people romanticize the smell of a wood fire, but that's because they experience it occasionally while camping. You live in it constantly, and it's probably contributing to the lung problems you'll develop by age 45. Breakfast is already happening near the fire. A pot hangs over the flames, suspended from an iron hook that can be adjusted higher or lower depending on how much heat you want. Inside that pot is pottage, which is the medieval answer to what's for breakfast, lunch, dinner, about 80% of the time. Pottage is basically a thick porridge or thin stew, depending on how you want to frame it. Today's version contains oats, the cheap grain that grows reliably even in questionable soilsome water, maybe a handful of peas or beans if you've got them, and whatever vegetables are currently available. In late spring, that might mean some early cabbage or onions from the kitchen garden. In winter it might mean just oats and sadness. The consistency is somewhere between oatmeal and soup, and you've eaten some version of this almost every day of your entire life. There's bread, too. Yesterday's bread, hard as a rock because medieval peasant bread goes stale about 6 hours after baking. You can't exactly toast it crispy since that's not really a technique yet, so instead you just dunk it in the pottage to soften it enough to chew without risking your teeth. Your bread is dark, dense, and possibly contains some amount of ground-up grain husks that give it a gritty texture and questionable nutritional value. White bread exists, but that's for nobility and rich merchants. You get the brown stuff that's barely a step up from livestock feed. Someone hands you a wooden bowliar family owns maybe 4 bowls total, and you share them for every meal. Medieval peasants didn't have personal place settings or your special mug. You had communal vessels, and you ate what you got when you got it. The bowl is warm from the pottage, which is one of the day's small pleasures. You also get a cup of ale. Yes, for breakfast. Ale is the standard beverage for every meal, including the one right after church, and before you start imagining medieval peasants stumbling drunk through their fields, understand that this is small ale, extremely weak stuff, maybe 2 or 3% alcohol, brewed primarily because it's safer than drinking straight water. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval Europeans knew that drinking water made people sick, even though they didn't understand germ theory. They figured out through trial and error that ale, wine or cider beverages that required boiling or fermentation were safer than river water contaminated with animal waste and dead things upstream. So everyone drank alcohol all day, every day, but at concentrations that wouldn't even register on a modern breathalyzer. The ale tastes sour and yeasty and nothing like modern beer. Its unhopped hops won't become standard in English brewing until the 16th century, so instead it's flavoured with whatever herbs your wife or mother threw in during brewing. Maybe some ground ivy, maybe yarrow, maybe a mixture that she learned from her mother, who learned from her grandmother. Every household's ale tastes slightly different, and some are definitely better than others. Agnes down the lane makes ale that could strip paint, but Thomas the baker's wife makes stuff that's almost pleasant. You eat standing near the fire because sitting isn't really an option. Your cottage doesn't have chairs. Maybe there's a rough bench along one wall. Maybe there's a 3-legged stool that someone carved years ago, but mostly you just stand or squat while you eat. Furniture is expensive and requires either money or woodworking skills, and you have neither in abundance. The pottage is hot, bland, and filling. You can taste the oats, the slight earthiness of whatever vegetables got thrown in, and that omnipresent smoke flavour from the cooking fire. There's no salt. Salt is taxed and expensive, so you save it for preserving meat, not seasoning breakfast porridge. No sugar either, obviously. No spices, unless you count the occasional onion as exotic. It's just carbohydrates and water, hot enough to feel like a meal. Your family eats together in relative silence. Conversation happens, but it's minimal comments about the day's work ahead, reminders about obligations, maybe someone mentions that the cow seemed off yesterday. Medieval peasants weren't sitting around having deep philosophical breakfast discussions. They were tired, hungry, and focused on consuming enough calories to survive another day of manual labour. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants actually enjoyed their food or just viewed it as fuel. Some scholars point to feast day accounts and celebrations as evidence that people took pleasure in eating and looked forward to special meals. Others argue that chronic scarcity meant food was mainly about survival, not pleasure. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. You don't hate this pottage, but you're also not posting it on medieval Instagram with blessed. You finish your portion and drain the last of your ale. The sun is definitely up now. Proper daylight filtering through the gaps in your walls and the smoke hole above. The day's real work is about to begin, and this breakfast minimal as it washes your fuel for the next several hours until you break around midday for another round of pottage and bread. You step back outside, and the village is fully awake now. The sun has cleared the eastern tree line, casting long shadows across the muddy lanes between cottages. The temperature has climbed maybe 5 degrees, which means it's gone from genuinely cold to merely unpleasant. You're going to be sweating by midday, but right now you're grateful for that scratchy wool tunic. Your tools are leaning against the outside wall of your cottage where you left them yesterday, a wooden spade with an iron tip if you're lucky, or just fire-hardened wood if you're not. There's also a rake made from a tree branch with smaller sticks lashed perpendicular, and maybe a hoe with a blade that's been sharpened and resharpened so many times it's now a weird curved shape that barely resembles its original form. These tools represent a significant investment. A good iron spade blade might cost several days' wages, and you guard it jealously because replacing it would be catastrophic for your family's finances. You heft the spade over your shoulder and start walking. The path to the common fields is well worn, a track carved by centuries of feet heading to and from the same destination. In wet weather, which is frequently, because this is your Epitha path, becomes a muddy trench that sucks at your feet and ruins whatever footwear you're attempting. Today it's dry enough, just hard-packed dirt with the occasional stone. Other villages are converging on the same path. There's a whole stream of people heading out, looking like the world's least enthusiastic parade. Everyone carries tools. Everyone walks with that same resigned gait of someone facing another day of back-breaking agricultural labour. Nobody's running or hurrying. You'll be out there until sunset regardless, so there's no point in rushing. Thomas the baker passes you going the opposite direction, already heading back from the fields after checking his strips early. He's got flour under his fingernails and that perpetually exhausted look of someone who works 2 jobs, because of course he does. He bakes bread for the village and still has to farm his allotted land. Medieval specialization only goes so far when everyone needs food security. Reeve's in a mood, Thomas mutters as he passes. This is the medieval equivalent of the boss is cranky today, and you file that information away for later. The Reeve is the village's enforcer, the guy who makes sure everyone's doing their feudal obligations, and if he's in a mood it means he's going to be extra particular about measuring everyone's work. You nod at Agnes, who somehow managed to leave her baby with someone and is now carrying a smaller digging tool. Her teenage daughter walks beside her, already looking as tired as the adults. That girl is maybe 13 and has been doing full adult agricultural labour since she was 8 or 9. Childhood as a distinct, protected phase of life is a concept that won't really emerge for another few centuries. The fields open up ahead of you. This is the part that always strikes visitors to medieval agricultural sites, the sheer openness of it. There are no fences dividing individual properties, no neat suburban plots with property lines. Instead, you've got massive open fields divided into long, narrow strips of land that look like someone took a giant comb to the landscape. This is the famous strip farming system that historians get weirdly excited about. Each family in the village has been allocated several strips scattered across different fields. You don't own a nice compact farm where all your land is together. Instead, you've got 1 strip in the north field, 2 in the south field, 1 near the woods, and maybe another one in that boggy area that floods every spring. This scattering is partly about fairness, making sure everyone gets some good soil and some terrible soil, and partly about risk management. Your strips are marked by nothing more than custom and mutual agreement. There might be a stone at each end, or just a slight furrow indicating where your neighbour's strip ends and yours begins. This system requires everyone to be honest and to not gradually plough an extra 6 inches into your neighbour's strip each year, which definitely never happens and is absolutely not a source of constant village disputes. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The medieval 3-field system was actually a significant agricultural innovation. 1 field grows winter wheat planted in fall, 1 grows spring crops like barley or oats, and 1 lies fallow to recover nutrients. This rotation was more productive than older 2-field systems and helped support population growth across Europe, even if it meant you spent your entire life staring at variations of grain. You reach your first strip and survey the work ahead. The soil is dark, recently manured you helped spread that manure a few weeks ago, which was exactly as pleasant as it sounds, and ready for weeding or planting depending on the season. Today, you're planting barley, which means walking the length of your strip multiple times, broadcasting seeds by hand, then covering them and hoping the birds don't eat everything before it germinates. William the old-timer is already working his adjacent strip, moving with that slow efficiency of someone who's done this exact task for 50 years. He doesn't look up when you arrive, just keeps moving down his furrow with metronomic consistency. That's going to be you someday if you survive that long just another old peasant shuffling through the same motions until your body gives out. The morning sun catches the dew still clinging to the grass at the field edges. It's almost pretty in that, sure, manual labour in service of feudal obligations can be scenic kind of way. The skylarks are singing overhead, totally oblivious to the class struggle happening below them. A gentle breeze carries the smell of turned earth and distant livestock. You plant your spade in the ground and start working. The blade cuts through soil that's been worked for generations, maybe centuries. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants felt any connection to their land or just viewed it as a survival tool. But standing here with dirt under your nails and decades of this exact work ahead of you, the question feels a bit academic. Connected or not, you're stuck with it. The rhythm begins dig, turn, step, repeat. Your neighbours are doing the same thing on their strips, everyone working in parallel, creating this weird, synchronized agricultural dance across the landscape. No music, no conversation yet, just the sounds of tools hitting earth and occasional grunts of effort. This is your life. This field, these strips, this village. The horizon is maybe 2 miles away in any direction, and you'll probably never go beyond it. The three-field system sounds complicated when scholars describe it, but living inside it, you barely think about the mechanics. It's just how things have always been done, passed down from your grandfather to your father to you, and presumably you'll pass the same information to your son while he tries not to fall asleep during the explanation. Here's how it works. The village has 3 massive fields, creatively named the North Field, the South Field, and the West Field. Revolutionary naming convention there. Each field is divided into those strips we talked about, and every household has strips scattered across all 3 fields. This year, the North Field grows winter wheat, the South Field grows spring barley, and the West Field just sits there doing nothing, which is called lying fallow, and is apparently very important for soil health. Next year, everything rotates. The North Field that grew wheat will now grow barley. The South Field that grew barley will lie fallow and recover. The West Field that was fallow will get planted with winter wheat. It's a slow agricultural carousel that repeats indefinitely, or at least until something dramatic happens like a war or a plague, or your lord deciding he wants to convert everything to sheep pasture. The winter wheat gets planted in fall, October or November, whenever the weather cooperates. You scatter the seeds, pray the winter isn't too harsh, and then hope it survives until spring. Winter wheat is a gamble because a really bad freeze can kill your entire crop, but if it survives, you get an earlier harvest and generally better yields than spring-planted grains. It's also the more valuable crop, the stuff that makes the better bread, which means the Lord's bailiff pays extra attention to your winter wheat strips to make sure you're not skimming off the top before you pay your tithes. Spring crops barley, oats, peas, beans get planted around now in late April or early May, once the ground thaws and you can actually work the soil without breaking your spade. Spring grains are safer because you're not gambling on winter survival, but they also yield less and are generally considered inferior. Barley mostly goes to making ale, which at least gives it a clear purpose. Oats are for porridge and horse feed, and there's some debate about which use is more important. Then there's the fallow field, which is just sitting there looking empty and feeling very virtuous about its soil recovery. The fallow field isn't completely unused. You graze livestock on it, which has the dual benefit of feeding your animals and fertilizing the soil with their manure. Sheep, cows, pigs and geese all take turns wandering across the fallow field, depositing nutrients in the most natural fertilizer system ever devised. It's elegant in its simplicity and disgusting in its implementation. Historians still argue whether the three-field system was actually as widespread as textbooks claim, or if regional variations were more common than the standard model suggests. Some villages stuck with two-field rotation because they didn't have enough land or labour for the third field. Some experimented with four-field systems centuries before the agricultural revolution supposedly invented them. But your village does three fields because that's what the old people say works, and nobody's interested in agricultural innovation that might reduce yields and cause starvation. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some medieval villages had field systems so complex that disputes over strip boundaries required bringing in special arbitrators from neighbouring towns. Imagine being that Gaia professional medieval strip measurer, whose entire job is settling arguments about whether Agnes's barley strip encroached 8 inches into Thomas's wheat strip. That's a real occupation that really existed, and it says something about both medieval precision and medieval pettiness. The beauty of this system, if you can call agricultural labour beautiful, is that it spreads risk. If the winter wheat fails because of a harsh freeze, you've still got spring barley. If the spring crops struggle because of a dry summer, hopefully the winter wheat already harvested will see you through. And because everyone has strips in all three fields, a crop failure affects everyone equally rather than destroying individual families. It's communal suffering, which is apparently better than individualized suffering, or at least that's the theory. The downside is inefficiency. You can't just work one compact farm at your own pace. Instead, you're coordinating with dozens of other families trying to schedule ploughing and planting and harvesting around everyone else's needs. The whole village has to agree when to start planting each field. Everyone has to cooperate on things like pest control and drainage. If your neighbour decides his strip needs an extra drainage ditch and it floods your strip in the process, well, welcome to medieval community property disputes. You're currently working in what will be the spring barley field, preparing your strip for planting. The soil here is decent, not the premium dark loam of the lower field, but not the rocky nightmare soil up near the woods either. You got lucky in the strip allocation this generation. Your grandfather apparently had terrible strips that flooded every spring, and he spent 40 years fighting with neighbours over drainage rights. You inherited better placement through random chance and the death of a childless neighbour whose strips got redistributed. The work is mind-numbing. Broadcast the seeds from your bag that's literally just grabbing handfuls and throwing them in a sweeping arc across your strip while walking forward. Try to get even coverage. Hope you don't waste seeds by throwing too densely or doom yourself to sparse crops by throwing too lightly. Medieval agriculture is surprisingly full of these little skill-based tasks that separate decent farmers from terrible ones, but from the outside it all looks like random seed scattering. After broadcasting, you'll need to cover the seeds, either by raking soil over them or driving livestock across the strip to trample them in. Both methods work adequately. Neither method is particularly sophisticated. You're essentially relying on the seed's natural desire to grow and hoping conditions cooperate because advanced agricultural science won't be invented for another few centuries. Your back is already starting to hurt and it's not even mid-morning. That's the thing about medieval agricultural labour, that historical reenactors always underestimate it's not just hard work, it's repetitive hard work that you do for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for your entire adult life. Your body is going to be permanently bent by age 50 if you make it that far. Your hands will be calloused lumps. Your joints will ache in cold weather. This isn't an adventure. It's a slow grinding down of your physical form in service of growing grain. But the fields are peaceful. You'll give them that. The morning light is soft across the open landscape. Birds are doing their bird things in the hedgerows. There's something meditative about repetitive labour once you accept that thinking too hard about it will drive you insane. So you don't think. You just broadcast seeds, step forward, broadcast seeds, step forward, and let your mind drift to nothing in particular. After you've finished broadcasting seeds on your first strip, you head to the section that needs actual ploughing. This is where things get interesting, and by interesting I mean you get to spend quality time with an ox who absolutely does not want to be here. The ox is communally owned, shared among several families because nobody can afford to own and feed a draft animal year-round just for their own use. You've reserved your ploughing time for this morning, which means the ox is theoretically yours until midday, assuming William doesn't show up claiming he had the ox scheduled and you're trying to steal his slot. Medieval scheduling disputes are their own special circle of hell. The ox is named something uninspired like Brownie, or just Ox, because medieval peasants weren't big on creative pet names. He's massive. Maybe 1,200 pounds of muscle and bad attitude, with horns that could absolutely gore you if he felt motivated. Oxen are castrated bulls, which supposedly makes them calmer and more manageable than intact bulls, but this particular specimen didn't get that memo. He's currently standing in the communal barn area looking at you with those large, judgmental ox eyes that convey deep reluctance about the work ahead. You approach with the yoke a heavy wooden beam that fits across the ox's shoulders and distributes the pulling force. Getting the yoke on requires cooperation from an animal that weighs 10 times what you do and has no particular incentive to help. You coax, you push, you eventually get the thing positioned while the ox sighs dramatically, like you're ruining his entire day. The plough is waiting at the field edge. It's wooden with an iron ploughshare that's the blade part that actually cuts the earth. This is serious equipment, expensive enough that it's also communally owned, maintained by the village blacksmith, and treated with more respect than most people's children. Breaking the plough would be catastrophic. You'd have to pay for repairs, lose your ploughing time, and face the collective anger of everyone else waiting their turn. You attach the plough to the ox's yoke using leather straps that have been repaired so many times they're more knot than original material. The connection system is simple but effective. The ox pulls, the plough cuts, the earth turns over, and theoretically you end up with nice furrows ready for planting. That's the theory. In practice, you spend half your time fighting with the ox, untangling the plough from rocks, and trying not to create crooked furrows that will embarrass you for the entire growing season. Ready for another glorious day of back-breaking labour? That's John, working his adjacent strip with his own ox. John is roughly your age, married with 4 kids, and possessed of the kind of dark humour that medieval peasants probably invented as a coping mechanism. "Can't wait," you reply, guiding your ox to the starting position. Nothing I love more than staring at a cow's rear end for 6 hours. "That's an ox," John corrects cheerfully. "Cows are the ones that give milk. Oxen are the ones that give you constant disappointment and occasional hoof-related injuries. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Oxen were the primary draft animals in medieval Europe because they were stronger than horses for ploughing heavy soil, cheaper to feed, and could be eaten when they got too old to work. Horses existed and were used for ploughing in some regions, but they required more expensive feed oats instead of grass and were generally reserved for wealthier farmers or for transportation rather than field work. Your ox is basically a slow, stubborn tractor that you can eventually turn into stew. The ox begins pulling. The plough blade bites into earth. You walk behind, using a wooden handle to guide the plough's direction while trying to maintain a straight line. It's harder than it looks. The soil has rocks and roots and uneven patches that try to pull the plough off course. The ox has opinions about speed and direction that don't always align with your plans. You're basically negotiating with an animal about agricultural geometry while your back screams in protest. "Heard the Reeves coming around today?" John mentions casually. This is how village gossip spreads during field work, in between the grunts and curses. Something about measuring everyone's winter wheat yield. You groan? The Reeve measuring yields means he's calculating tax obligations, which means someone's about to discover they owe more grain than they thought. The medieval tax system is bewilderingly complex. Owe a portion to the Lord, a tithe to the church, payments for using the communal mill and oven, and various other fees that seem to materialize whenever the authorities need money. Course he is, you mutter. God forbid we keep enough grain to actually eat through winter. Speaking of which, John continues, because apparently we're sharing all the village drama this morning, seen Thomas's new goat. You have seen Thomas's new goat. Everyone has seen Thomas's new goat, because it's suspiciously nice for a goat that Thomas claims he bred himself. It's plump, healthy, and has a coat quality that suggests significantly better breeding than anything in Thomas's current livestock situation. Definitely stole it, you say confidently. Oh, absolutely stole it, John agrees. Question is where from. My money's on the monastery pasture, but Agnes thinks he got it from a travelling merchant. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants were generally honest or if petty theft was just an accepted part of village life. Some scholars point to the extensive legal records of property disputes as evidence that people took ownership seriously. Others argue that those same legal records prove everyone was constantly stealing from everyone else. The truth is probably that it varied by village, by individual, and by how hungry people were that particular year. The ox stops moving. Just stops mid-furrow, like he's decided this is a union-mandated break. You make encouraging sounds. You push against his massive flank, which accomplishes nothing except making you look foolish. The ox remains stationary, chewing something invisible, contemplating ox philosophy. Want to borrow my stick? John offers, holding up a switch he uses to encourage his own ox. Does it work? Not really, but it makes me feel productive. You eventually get the ox moving again through a combination of coaxing, pulling, and accepting that he'll restart when he's good and ready, not before. Medieval agriculture requires patience in addition to strength, which is probably good character building or whatever people tell themselves to cope with powerlessness. The weather is holding, which everyone's relieved about. Too much rain, and the fields become impassable mud. Too little, and the spring crops struggle. You're aiming for that sweet spot of adequate moisture and cooperative temperatures, which seems to happen roughly 70% of the time in a good year and maybe 40% in a bad year. Think we'll get rain by Sunday? John asks, because medieval people discuss weather constantly. When your entire livelihood depends on precipitation patterns, weather becomes a legitimate obsession. Hope not. Got to finish this strip before the ground gets too soft. The conversation continues in this vain weather predictions based on folk wisdom and cloud shapes, complaints about feudal obligations, speculation about who's sleeping with whom, and ongoing analysis of Thomas's suspiciously nice goat. It's simultaneously boring and essential, the social glue that holds village life together during endless hours of manual labour. Your furrow is reasonably straight, which is a minor victory. The ox is cooperating adequately, which is a major one. The sun is climbing higher, and you're sweating through your tunic despite the morning chill. Just another day in paradise, medieval style. You're maybe 2 hours into ploughing when you hear the sound that makes every peasant tense up slightly hoofbeats. Not the lumbering pace of an ox or the casual click-clop of a farmer's horse, but the deliberate, authoritative rhythm of someone who has both a decent horse and a reason to be riding it around the village at mid-morning. The reeve has arrived. His name is Robert, though everyone calls him the Reeve to his face and significantly less flattering names behind his back. He's technically a peasant himself, elected by the village to serve as the Lord's representative, which makes him the medieval equivalent of middle management, thatted by the workers below him, barely tolerated by the actual lord above him, and trapped in a position that guarantees he'll make enemies no matter what he does. Robert rides a decent brown mare that's probably worth more than your entire cottage and everything in it. He's dressed better than the average peasant. This tunic is newer. His boots are actual leather boots instead of racked foot rags, and he carries a wooden staff that's both a symbol of his authority and presumably useful for hitting people who give him lip. Not that he does that often. Mostly he just looks disappointed in everyone, which is somehow worse. "Morning, lads," Robert calls out, dismounting near where you and John are working. His tone is professionally friendly in that way. That means he's about to tell you something you don't want to hear. You and John stop working and lean on your respective ploughs in that universal pose of workers pretending they weren't just gossiping about their supervisor. The oxen immediately take this as their cue to also stop everything and stand there like furry statues. Reeve, you acknowledge neutrally. Fine morning for ploughing, Robert observes, which is the kind of meaningless small talk that precedes bad news. Making good progress on your strips, I see. Here it comes. Lord's bailiff will be coming through next week, Robert continues, pulling out a wax tablet where he's been keeping notes. Medieval bureaucracy uses these reusable wax tablets for temporary records before transferring important information to parchment, which is expensive. The wax can be smoothed over and reused indefinitely, making it perfect for a reeve who needs to track everyone's obligations and violations. He'll be measuring the winter wheat yields and calculating this year's obligations. You and John exchange glances. The bailiff is the reeve's boss, the Lord's actual professional administrator who handles the serious business of extracting maximum value from the peasantry. When the bailiff shows up, it means money or grain is about to change hands, and it's never flowing in your direction. We already paid at Christmas, John points out, which is technically true, but also irrelevant. That was the Christmas tax, Robert says patiently, like he's explaining to slow children. This is the regular grain tithe, plus the mill fee, plus the use fee for the communal oven, plus a special assessment because the Lord's daughter is getting married and apparently weddings don't pay for themselves. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval peasants typically owed somewhere between 30 and 50% of their produce to various authorities. The Lord got his portion, the church got its tithe, theoretically 10% but often more, and various fees and taxes consumed the rest. In a bad harvest year, this could mean literally not having enough grain left to feed your family through winter. In theory, the Lord was supposed to help his peasants in crisis. In practice, that was hit or miss. Robert consults his wax tablet again. Also need to check field boundaries. There've been complaints about some strips encroaching on others. He looks meaningfully at both of you, though you're pretty sure neither you nor John have been gradually stealing land. Probably, that's William, John says immediately. Old man's been shifting his boundary stones for years. Everyone knows it. I'll check William's strips too, Robert says diplomatically, but I'm checking everyone's while I'm out here. The bailiff wants a full accounting. Historians still argue whether reeves were generally corrupt or just doing an impossible job in a system designed to exploit everyone. Some records show reeves taking bribes, falsifying measurements, and pocketing fees. Other records show reeves trying to protect their villagers from excessive noble demands and getting fired for their efforts. Robert seems to fall somewhere in the middle. He's not going to risk his position to help you, but he's also not actively trying to make your life worse. The quirky reality, being reeve, was often a rotating position nobody wanted. Villagers would elect someone for a year or several years, and that person had to abandon some of their own farm work to handle administrative duties. You got a small reduction in your own fees as compensation, but mostly you got resentment from your neighbours and pressure from the Lord. It's the kind of job that medieval people literally wrote complaints about in the margins of manorial documents. "Here begins my year of misery as reeve," one actual medieval note reads. Robert walks along the boundary between your strip and John's, checking the marker stones. They haven't moved. You both know better than to risk getting caught in an obvious boundary violation when the bailiff's coming to inspect, but Robert has to look anyway, making a show of measuring with a knotted rope he carries for exactly this purpose. "Looks acceptable," he finally declares, making a note on his tablet, "but that drainage ditch is getting close to your neighbour's land." He points to where you've been gradually expanding a small trench to keep water from pooling on your strip. "That drainage was my father's," you protest. "Been there for 20 years. "Then it should be fine," Robert says, but he makes another note anyway. Everything gets documented, every minor dispute and boundary question, because the medieval manorial system runs on documentation. Even though most peasants can't read, the lords and their administrators keep meticulous records of who owes what, who's violated which custom, and who needs to be squeezed harder next tax season. The other thing, Robert continues, and you can tell he's been saving the worst for last, is the Lord needs labour for harvest on his demesne. 3 days from each household during the wheat harvest, 4 during barley. The demesne is the Lord's personal land, separate from the strips you farm for yourself. You owe the Lord labour on his demesne as part of your feudal obligations, which means you have to abandon your own farm work during the crucial harvest season to gather the Lord's grain first. It's one of the most hated aspects of the feudal system because it directly conflicts with your own survival needs. 3 days? John sounds pained. Last year it was 2. Last year the Lord was feeling generous, Robert says without sympathy. This year his daughter's getting married. Wedding expenses, like I said. You want to point out that the Lord's family finances shouldn't be your problem, but that's the kind of attitude that gets you labelled a troublemaker and assigned even worse obligations. So you just nod and try to calculate how you're going to harvest your own grain while also spending 7 days total working the Lord's fields. Robert makes a few more notes, reminds you both to check your ploughs for damage before tomorrow, and rides off toward the next cluster of workers. The moment he's out of earshot, John unleashes a string of creative curses that would make the parish priest faint. 7 days, John repeats. 7 days of free labour because some noble girl needs a fancy wedding. Could be worse, you offer without conviction. How? Could be 8 days. The oxen, sensing the humans have stopped moving again, settle into comfortable standing positions. Your back aches. The sun is climbing higher, and you've got roughly 6 more hours of this before you can call it a day. Medieval life, it's exactly as fun as it sounds. Around late morning, your plough blade hits a rock with enough force that you feel the impact shudder through the wooden handles and into your already complaining shoulders. The ox stops immediately, probably grateful for the excuse. You unhitch the plough and examine the damage. The iron share has a new dent that's going to make ploughing even more difficult than it already was. Fantastic, you mutter, because of course this happens. Medieval farming equipment breaks constantly, and every break costs time and money you don't have. You leave the plough at the field edge and head back toward the village centre, carrying the damaged share. The ox, Canwaith's not going anywhere, and honestly he's probably thrilled about the unscheduled break. You need the blacksmith, which means you're about to have a very medieval conversation about repair costs and payment schedules. The village centre is the closest thing you have to a commercial district, which means there are maybe 5 actual buildings clustered around the church and the manor house that serve specific economic functions. Everything else is just residential cottages that look identical to your sewn room, thatch roof, dirt floor, generalized squalor. The blacksmith's forge is the first building you pass, and you can hear it before you see it. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil echoes across the village, punctuated by the whoosh of bellows feeding the fire. Smoke pours from the open front of the forge, and the heat is intense even from 20 feet away. Inside, Edmund the blacksmith is working on what looks like a hinge for someone's door. He's stripped to the waist despite the spring chill, his torso covered in old burn scars and a fine coating of soot that never quite washes off. Being a blacksmith is simultaneously one of the most important and most dangerous jobs in the village. You work with fire and molten metal all day and everyone depends on you, but you're also constantly one mistake away from serious injury. "Edmund," you call out, waiting for him to finish his current strike. You don't interrupt a blacksmith mid-swing because startling someone holding a 3-pound hammer near molten iron is how accidents happen. He looks up, squints at you through the smoke, and nods acknowledgement. You hold up your damaged ploughshare. "Rock," you explain simply. Edmund sets down his hammer and examines the blade with professional interest. Can fix it. Not cheap though, never is. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval blacksmiths were absolutely essential to village life, but weren't actually that wealthy. They worked long hours in dangerous conditions, and while they charged for their services, they also owed fees to the manor for the privilege of operating a forge. The lord owned the right to metalworking in his territory, so Edmund pays an annual fee for his workshop, plus a portion of his earnings, plus he still has to farm his own strips like everyone else. Specialisation doesn't exempt you from agricultural obligations. 3 pennies, Edmund says, which is roughly a day and a half of wages for basic labour. Or I can take it in trade got any eggs. Medieval economics runs heavily on barter because actual currency is scarce. You could pay Edmund in the few pennies you've saved, but eggs or cheese or labour are often more practical. The problem is, you don't have extra eggs right now because your chickens are going through a non-productive phase that you suspect is their personal protest against medieval life. I'll bring you a chicken next week, you offer. The brown one that stopped laying. Edmund considers this. A chicken is worth more than 3 pennies in pure economic terms, but he'll get meat plus the eventual eggs if he can get her laying again. Fair enough. Come back tomorrow afternoon. You leave the forge and continue through the village centre. The miller's operation is impossible to miss. It's the other building, besides the church made of actual stone, and the massive wooden water wheel is currently turning with inexorable force, powered by the stream that runs through the village. The wheel connects to grinding stones inside, and you can hear the rumble of grain being crushed into flour, even from outside. The miller's name is Walter, and everyone suspects he's slightly corrupt, but nobody can prove it. The Lord requires all grain to be ground at the manorial milieu. Can't just use hand querns at home because that would deprive the Lord of his milling fees. So Walter has a monopoly, charges whatever he wants, and has a reputation for keeping a bit extra from every sack that passes through his mill. The miller's thumb, John calls it, the practice of pressing your thumb into the scale when measuring flour, tilting the weight in the miller's favour. It's the medieval equivalent of corporate price gouging, except the corporation is one guy with a water wheel and feudal backing. Walter is outside his mill right now, arguing with Agnes about something. Their voices carry across the square, Agnes's tone sharp with frustration. "It was a full sack when I brought it. Shrinkage during grinding," Walter replies smoothly. Happens to everyone. Historians still argue whether medieval millers were genuinely dishonest or just easy scapegoats for a system everyone hated. Milling fees were universally despised. You had to pay for the privilege of turning your grain into flour, using a facility you didn't choose, at prices you couldn't negotiate. Some millers probably were corrupt. Others probably just became the face of broader economic resentment. Either way, nobody trusts Walter. You pass Agnes and Walter still arguing and spot the cooper's workshop across from the church. Richard the cooper is sitting outside in the sunlight, shaving wooden staves for barrel construction. Cooper work is meticulous, and skilled barrels have to be watertight for storing ale, oil, grain or preserved food, and making them requires precise measurements and practiced technique. Richard is maybe 50, which makes him ancient by medieval standards, but his hands are still steady and his eye for wood grain is legendary. He's fitting wooden staves together in a pattern that looks random but will somehow become a perfectly shaped barrel through techniques that look like magic if you don't understand geometry. "Morning, Richard," you offer as you pass. He grunts acknowledgement without looking up from his work. Richard isn't unfriendly exactly, just deeply focused on his craft in a way that doesn't leave much room for social pleasantries. He's also one of the few craftsmen who seems to actually enjoy his work rather than just tolerating it as a means of survival. Here's your quirky tidbit. Medieval coopers had their own specialized guilds with secret techniques passed down through apprenticeships. Some barrel-making methods were considered trade secrets, and a master cooper could identify who made a barrel just by examining the joinery. It's the kind of specialized knowledge that sounds trivial until you realize waterproof containers were absolutely critical for food storage and transportation. Like Edmund and Walter, Richard pays fees to the manor for the right to operate his workshop. The Lord owns basically every economic activity in the village and charges for the privilege of participation. It's a system that ensures wealth flows upward while everyone else scrambles to survive. The church bells ring for Sext, the midday prayer service. Some people will stop work to attend. Most won't, because the fields don't care about canonical hours and missing ploughing time means not eating next winter. Father Benedict probably won't even notice who shows up. He's too busy with his own administrative duties, tracking baptisms and marriages and deaths in records that will eventually prove to historians that medieval people lived surprisingly complex lives. You head back toward the fields, thinking about the chicken yellow, Edmund, the grain yellow Walter next harvest, the barrel fees Richard pays, and the general economic reality that everyone works constantly and somehow nobody except the Lord ever seems to get ahead. It's a great system, very sustainable, definitely won't lead to any future peasant revolts or social upheaval. Everything's fine. By the time you make it back to your strip, the sun is nearly overhead and your stomach is making very pointed observations about its empty state. You've been working since dawn with nothing but that morning pottage, and your body is ready to negotiate terms for continued labour. John is already sitting at the edge of his strip, legs stretched out in the grass, eating from a cloth bundle his wife packed this morning. His ox stands nearby, also taking a break, looking as relieved as a draft animal can look. "Took your time," John comments around a mouthful of something. "Blacksmith," you explain, settling down on the grass near your own ox. The ground is slightly damp from morning dew but warming in the sun, and honestly after several hours of manual labour, sitting on anything feels like luxury. Your own meal is waiting where you left it, wrapped in a scrap of linen tied to your belt. Medieval peasants don't have lunch boxes or insulated bags. You've got a piece of cloth and whatever fits inside it that won't spoil by midday. You unwrap the bundle and survey the contents. Bread from 2 days ago that's now approaching the density of roofing material, a chunk of hard cheese that's more rind than actual cheese, and 2 onions that you pulled from the garden this morning. The bread is dark rye, coarser textured, and requires serious jaw strength. You can't just bite into medieval peasant bread like it's a modern baguette. You have to really commit to the chewing process. Some of the grain husks are still visible in the loaf, which gives it that authentic, eating, very crunchy dirt texture that nobody asked for but everyone gets anyway. You pull out your small knife, the one multi-purpose blade you own that's used for eating, cutting rope, minor repairs, and occasionally defending yourself from aggressive geese hand saw off a chunk of bread. It takes effort. The crust fights back. This is bread that could theoretically be used as a building material if you ran out of stones. The cheese is at least easier to manage. It's hard cheese, probably made months ago, and aged into something that can survive being carried around in a sweaty cloth bundle without immediately spoiling. The flavour is sharp, salty, and vaguely reminiscent of the goat it came from. You can taste the barnyard in every bite, which is either charming or disgusting depending on your perspective and hunger level. Want an onion? You offer John, holding up one of yours. Got my own, thanks. He produces his own onion from his bundle, bites into it raw like it's an apple. This is normal. Medieval peasants eat raw onions with their meals because vegetables that don't require cooking save firewood and time. The fact that you're all going to have aggressively onion-scented breath for the rest of the day is simply accepted as the price of efficient eating. You bite into your own onion. It's pungent and sharp and makes your eyes water slightly, but it's also genuinely tasty in that your body desperately needs fresh vegetables kind of way. After months of winter eating where fresh produce was basically non-existent, spring onions feel like a delicacy even though you're literally just eating them raw in a field. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval peasants actually had relatively diverse diets when you factor in the full seasonal cycle, even if they weren't eating exotic spices or fancy meats. Spring and summer brought fresh vegetables, fruits, and herbs. Fall brought harvest grains and the meat from animals slaughtered before winter. Winter was rough lots of preserved foods, dried beans, and root vegetables stored in cellars. But the stereotype of peasants only eating bread and suffering is somewhat exaggerated. They ate bread and suffered, yes, but also onions and cheese and occasional eggs, and sometimes even meat. Plus, they suffered. Someone passes around a leather flask of ale. It's communal. Everyone working this section of the field takes a drink and passes it along. The ale is warm from sitting in the sun, weakly alcoholic, and tastes faintly sour with that herbal undertone from whatever was used instead of hops. You take several long swallows because you're genuinely thirsty, and this is safer than drinking from the stream that has livestock standing in it upstream. The group eating lunch has grown to maybe 6 or 7 people, all sitting in the grass at field's edge, taking advantage of the brief respite. This is when the day's gossip gets properly distributed. Morning work is too scattered for good conversation, but lunch brings everyone together. "Heard," Thomas got called in by the reeve, someone mentions. "Something about his new goat." Multiple people laugh. The Thomas goat situation has apparently reached official investigation status. Probably stole it from the monastery, Agnes offers. She's sitting slightly apart, nursing her baby, while simultaneously eating bread one-handed in a display of maternal multitasking. Brother Paul was complaining last market day about missing livestock. Thomas wouldn't steal from monks, William the old-timer says, though he doesn't sound entirely convinced. That's asking for divine punishment. Divine punishment versus having a decent milk goat, someone counters. I'd risk it. Historians still argue whether medieval people were genuinely religious or just socially conformist. Everyone attends church, everyone uses religious language, everyone claims to fear divine judgment, but they also constantly violate religious rules about honesty, sexuality, work on holy days, and proper Christian charity. Some scholars think medieval faith was deeply genuine but coexisted with practical survival needs. Others think the church had social control but limited actual spiritual influence. The truth is probably that medieval people, like people always, contained multitudes and contradictions. The conversation drifts to weather predictions. Everyone's convinced it's going to rain by Thursday based on the way the clouds looked this morning and something William's grandmother supposedly taught him about bird behavior. Medieval weather prediction is part observation, part folklore, and part wishful thinking. But when your survival depends on precipitation patterns, you pay attention to anything that might offer an edge. My knee's been aching, William adds. Always means rain within 3 days. Your knee always aches, John points out. You're 70 years old and you've been farming since you were 6. Your knee is just being a knee. 68, William corrects with dignity. And my knee is a very reliable weather predictor, thank you very much. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some medieval weather prediction methods were surprisingly sophisticated, based on centuries of agricultural observation. Others were completely superstitious. Nonsense. The trick was that nobody could reliably distinguish between the two categories until scientific meteorology was invented, so people just tried everything and remembered the times it worked while conveniently forgetting the failures. William's knee probably has roughly the same accuracy as any other medieval forecasting method, which is to say, slightly better than random chance. You finish your bread, cheese and onions, washing the last bites down with more ale from the communal flask. It's not a fancy meal, but it's filling enough, and after 4 or 5 hours of physical labour, your standards for good food have adjusted significantly downward. Hot, edible and available. That's the complete criteria. The break has lasted maybe 20 minutes. Nobody has a watch or any way to precisely measure time, but there's a collective sense of when the break has gone on long enough and work needs to resume. People start standing up, brushing grass off their clothes, making reluctant movements back toward their tools and waiting oxen. Back to paradise, John mutters, but he's smiling slightly. The lunch break has improved everyone's mood marginally, or at least provided enough calories to continue protesting their feudal obligations while also fulfilling them. You return to your plough, your ox, and the strip that still needs another few hours of work before you can call this section done. Your back aches, your hands are developing new blisters, and you're definitely going to smell like onions for the rest of the day. Just another glorious afternoon in the 15th century. The afternoon sun is genuinely oppressive now, beating down on the open fields with no shade in sight. You've stripped down to just your tunic, which is already soaked through with sweat and clinging uncomfortably to your back. Medieval deodorant doesn't exist. People just smell like people, amplified by labor and limited bathing opportunities. By mid-afternoon, the entire field crew smells like a locker room designed by someone who hates humanity. You've moved from plowing to weeding, which sounds easier, but is actually its own special form of torture. Weeding means bending over for hours, walking slowly down your strips, identifying unwanted plants among the grain seedlings, and pulling them out by hand. It's the kind of repetitive, back-destroying labor that gives you plenty of time to contemplate your life choices and wonder if joining a monastery might have been the better option. The weeds are everywhere. Thistles, nettles, various grasses that aren't the grain you planted, and some unidentifiable green things that are definitely not supposed to be there. Each one needs to be pulled individually, roots and all, because if you just snap off the top, it'll grow back and continue stealing nutrients from your actual crops. You grab a thistle without thinking, and the spines immediately remind you that nature is hostile and you should pay attention. Your hand comes away with several small puncture wounds that sting impressively for something so minor. Medieval people didn't have antibiotic ointment or even a clear understanding of infection, so these little injuries carry the low-grade risk of festering wound that might kill you eventually. You wipe your hand on your tunic and continue, because stopping work over minor injury isn't really an option. The soil is warm under your hands, almost hot, where the sun has been hitting it directly. You work your way down the strip, bent at the waist, fingers digging into earth to grasp weed roots. Pull, toss aside, step forward, repeat. Pull, toss aside, step forward, repeat. It's meditative in the way that complete monotony eventually breaks your brain and you enter a fugue state where time loses meaning. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval agricultural yields were surprisingly low by modern standards. Maybe 4 or 5 grains harvested for every 1 grain planted, compared to modern ratios of 30 or 40 to 1. This meant that crop loss to weeds, pests, weather or disease was genuinely catastrophic. Every weed you pull now is potentially several mouthfuls of bread next winter, which makes the tedious work feel slightly more urgent even as your back screams for you to stand up straight. Other workers are scattered across their own strips, creating this strange landscape of bent human figures dotting the fields like very slow, very tired scarecrows. Nobody's talking much anymore. Afternoon heat and exhaustion have killed the morning's conversational energy. Just the sounds of manual labor, rustling plants, occasional grunts of effort, someone cursing when they grab nettles wrong. Your strip has a particularly bad patch of some kind of creeping grass that's wrapped itself around your barley seedlings like it's personally offended by your agricultural efforts. You have to carefully separate the weed roots from the grain roots, trying not to damage the plants you actually want. It's finicky work that requires more attention than your heat-exhausted brain wants to provide. The sun continues its slow arc across the sky. You don't have a clock or any precise timekeeping, but you've developed that agricultural sense of time where you can estimate how much daylight remains by the sun's position. Still, several hours before sunset, which means several more hours of this exact activity. A lark is singing somewhere overhead, completely oblivious to the human suffering below. Birds have it so easy, they just fly around, eat bugs, sing their little songs, and don't owe feudal obligations to anyone. You briefly entertain the fantasy of being a bird before remembering that medieval people would happily trap and eat you, so maybe the grass isn't greener on the avian side either. Anyone else feel like their spine is trying to escape their body? That's John, a few strips over, apparently reaching his afternoon breaking point. Every day, you call back. It's character building. I have plenty of character. I'd like less character and more vertebral integrity. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants were generally healthy or suffering from chronic conditions caused by brutal labor. Some skeletons show evidence of arthritis, spinal compression, and repetitive stress injuries that would have made daily work genuinely painful. Other evidence suggests people adapted to physical labor and maintained reasonable health into middle age. The truth is probably that it varied by individual, by specific work demands, and by how lucky you got with genetics and injury. You straighten up for a moment, hands pressed against your lower back, trying to work out the knots. The view from standing height is almost worth the pane-open fields stretching in every direction, the village visible as a cluster of buildings to the east, forest marking the boundary to the west. It's genuinely beautiful, in a pastoral landscape painting kind of way, assuming you ignore the fact that you're trapped here forever and will probably die without ever seeing anything beyond this same view. A rabbit bolts from the hedgerow, startling you slightly. Rabbits are technically the Lord's property. Hunting rights belong to nobility, and poaching is illegal and punishable by fines or worse. But rabbits eat crops, which means there's a constant tension between don't hunt the Lord's rabbits and please someone do something about these crop-destroying rodents. Some people definitely poach anyway and just don't advertise it. Here's your quirky tidbit. Medieval poaching laws were so complex and contradictory that entire legal treatises were written trying to clarify who could hunt what and when. A peasant could legally kill rabbits, destroying his crops in some jurisdictions but not others. You could trap certain animals during certain seasons but not with certain methods. Breaking these laws could result in massive fines, imprisonment, or even mutilation in extreme cases. The rabbit that just ran past represents both dinner and potential legal disaster, which is very on-brand for medieval life. You return to weeding. Your pile of pulled weeds is growing at the end of the stripule. Gather them later and either feed them to livestock or let them dry and use them as additional compost. Nothing gets wasted because you can't afford waste. Even the weeds have secondary use. The afternoon grinds forward. Your hands are filthy, caked with soil under your fingernails and in every skin crease. Your back maintains its complaint. The sun maintains its heat. The weeds maintain their abundance. And you maintain the slow, steady work because that's what survival requires. Someone's child appears at the field edge carrying a water skin. The kid is maybe 8 years old and already helping with family labour in small ways, bringing water to workers, watching younger siblings, learning agricultural tasks gradually. Childhood is a brief interlude before full adult responsibilities kick in. You accept the water skin gratefully and take several long swallows. The water is lukewarm and tastes slightly of the leather container, but it's wet and that's all that matters. You wipe your mouth, thank the kid, and watch them continue down the line delivering water to other workers. Just a few more hours. Then you can stop bending over, gather your tools, and head home to an exciting evening of more physical labour before collapsing into sleep and doing this all again tomorrow. Living the Dream, Medieval Edition. While you're out in the fields contemplating your vertebrae's rebellion, the women of your household are engaged in their own forms of medieval multitasking that would make modern productivity experts weep. Your wifelets call her Margaret, because medieval women had about 6 names. Totalists currently managing approximately 4 different tasks simultaneously, and none of them are restful. She started her morning the same time you did, actually earlier, because someone had to get the fire going and prepare that thrilling breakfast pottage. But while you headed to the fields with your ox, Margaret stayed behind to handle the domestic labour that keeps the household functioning. And by domestic labour, we mean an endless series of physically demanding tasks that were absolutely essential but received exactly 0 recognition or compensation. Right now she's spinning wool. There's a wooden distaff tucked under her left arm, loaded with carded wool. That's wool that's been cleaned and combed until the fibres align properly. Her right hand works a drop spindle, which is basically a weighted stick that twists as it falls, turning fluffy wool into actual thread through a process that looks like magic if you don't understand physics. The technique requires constant attention and surprising skill. Pull the wool fibres from the distaff with just the right tension. Too much and they break. Too little and your thread is lumpy and weak. Keep the spindle spinning at the correct speed. Feed the twist up into the new fibre. Wind the finished thread onto the spindle. Repeat indefinitely until you have enough thread to weave into cloth, which will eventually become the clothes everyone in your family wears. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Most medieval clothing was produced entirely through household labour. Women grew or purchased raw wool, cleaned it, carded it, spun it into thread, wove the thread into cloth, cut and sewed the cloth into garments, and then maintained those garments through endless repairs. A single wool tunic might represent literally hundreds of hours of labor from start to finish, which is why people owned so few clothes and wore them until they literally fell apart. Margaret can spin while doing other things, which is one reason spinning became women's default task. She can walk to the well while spinning. She can supervise children while spinning. She can monitor the brewing vat while spinning. The drop spindle is portable and doesn't require both hands continuously, making it the perfect background task for a life that demands constant multitasking. Speaking of the brewing vat, Margaret breaks from spinning to check the ale situation. Your household brews ale roughly once a week because ale doesn't keep well, especially the weak small ale that everyone drinks constantly. The brewing process is happening in a large wooden vat near the fire, and it requires monitoring at specific intervals, or you end up with something that tastes like fermented regret. The vat contains water that was boiled yesterday, important for killing whatever parasites were living in the stream, water mixed with malted grain. Malting is its own process that Margaret did last week. Soak grain until it sprouts, dry it in a kiln or near the fire, grind it up. The sprouting activates enzymes that convert starches to sugars, which the yeast then converts to alcohol. Margaret doesn't know the biochemistry, but she knows the process works, passed down from her mother and grandmother in an unbroken chain of medieval brewing knowledge. She stirs the mash with a long wooden paddle, checking the consistency and smell. It's fermenting properly. You can tell by the slight bubbling and the sour-sweet scent that fills the cottage. In another day or two, this will be drinkable ale, assuming nothing goes wrong. And things can definitely go wrong. Bad batches happen. Sometimes the ale spoils before fermentation completes. Sometimes you get a batch that's too weak or too strong or tastes like feet. Brewing is part science, part experience, and part luck. Historians still argue whether medieval alewives, women who brewed for sale, not just household use, were genuinely skilled professionals or just making do with limited options. Some records show alewives running successful businesses, controlling significant household income, and even appearing in court to defend their brewing rights. Other evidence suggests brewing was seen as low-status work that anyone could do. The reality is probably that skill levels varied wildly, and good brewers had reputations while bad ones struggled to sell their product. Margaret moves from the brewing vat to the dairy corner. That's the shaded area outside where the milk bucket sits. Your household owns one cow, shared with your brother's family next door in a complex arrangement that involves alternating milking days and splitting the dairy production. Today is your day for the milk, which means Margaret needs to turn it into something that won't spoil by tomorrow. The milk is already separating, cream rising to the top. Margaret skims the cream carefully with a wooden paddle and transfers it to a butter churn, basically a wooden cylinder with a plunger. Making butter requires agitating cream until the fat globules stick together and separate from the liquid buttermilk. This takes approximately forever and will make your arms ache in new and interesting ways. Margaret starts churning while your daughter, maybe 10 years old, tends to the spindle. Margaret set aside. The girl's spinning is rough, her thread uneven and occasionally lumpy, but she's learning. By the time she's 15, she'll be able to spin smoothly while walking and carrying on conversations, just like her mother. Medieval girls learned textile work, the way medieval boys learned field work, through observation and gradually increasing responsibility, until one day you realize you've been doing adult labor since before you hit puberty. The rhythmic thunk of the churn creates a background sound to the household's activities. Margaret's arms work the plunger up and down, thunk, 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 while she monitors both the butter formation and the half-dozen other tasks that need attention. A baby cries from the corner, your youngest, maybe 18 months old, who was sleeping on a pile of rags and has decided sleep time is over. Your daughter abandons the spindle to pick up the baby, settling into the kind of practiced childcare that medieval girls mastered early. She'll carry that baby around on her hip for the next several hours, still managing to help with chores because medieval childcare wasn't about dedicated attention. It was about keeping children alive and present while adults worked. Here's your quirky tidbit. Medieval children had surprisingly high rates of minor injuries that would horrify modern parents. Babies crawled near open fires. Toddlers played with sharp tools left lying around. Kids fell into wells, streams, and storage pits with alarming frequency. Court records are full of accidental child deaths that sound preventable by modern standards, but when parents are working constantly and can't provide individual supervision, accidents happen. The children who survived developed impressive danger awareness at very young ages. The butter is starting to form. Margaret can feel the texture change under the plunger, the liquid transforming into solid fat. She continues churning until the butter has fully separated from the buttermilk, then pours off the liquid into a separate container. Buttermilk is useful for cooking and drinking, slightly sour but still nutritious. The butter gets worked and pressed to remove remaining liquid, then salted for preservation. This butter will be used sparingly, spread thin on bread, added to cooking pots for flavour, traded to neighbours for other goods. Butter is valuable enough that some of it might even go toward paying fees to the manor or church. Nothing in the medieval household exists purely for enjoyment. Everything has economic value that must be carefully managed. Margaret returns to spinning, her hands automatically finding the rhythm while her mind tracks the dozen other tasks awaiting attention. The bread needs baking later, using the communal oven that the Lord charges fees to use. The vegetables need checking in the garden plot behind the cottage. The chickens need feeding if there's any grain to spare, which there probably isn't. The floor rushes need changing because they're starting to smell even by medieval standards. And through it all, the endless spinning, turning raw wool into thread, because everyone needs clothes and nobody's inventing textile mills for another 3 centuries. Just another day in the domestic labour force that kept medieval life functioning while receiving almost no historical attention because, apparently, if it wasn't warfare or politics, it wasn't worth writing down. While Margaret spins and churns and manages the domestic operations, the village children are scattered across the landscape engaged in what modern people would call child labour, but medieval people just call Tuesday. Your son may be 7 years oldest, currently in the wheat field with 3 other kids his age, armed with a sling and an increasingly desperate mission to keep the birds away from the newly planted grain. The birds are winning. Crows, pigeons, and various other avian grain thieves have figured out that spring planting means easy food, and they're descending on the fields in numbers that suggest organized crime. Your son whirls his sling and launches a stone toward a cluster of crows pecking at the far end of the field. The stone lands approximately nowhere near the birds. The crows look at him with what can only be described as contempt and continue eating. "Get out of here," he yells, running toward them with his arms waving. The crows lift lazily into the air, circle once, and land again 30 feet away. This has been going on for hours. The kid is losing his voice and his sanity in roughly equal measure. Bird scaring is considered an appropriate job for children too young for heavier labour, but old enough to walk and throw things. It requires minimal skill but constant attention, and it's mind-numbingly boring. You stand in a field. You watch for birds. You attempt to scare them away. They leave temporarily and return immediately. Repeat until sunset. It's the kind of work that makes weeding look exciting by comparison. The other children working alongside your son are in various states of engagement. One girl is sitting down, supposedly watching for birds, but actually weaving grass stems into patterns. A boy about 9 years old is taking his job extremely seriously, maintaining a running commentary of threats directed at the crow population. "I'll make you into a pie. Come back here and I'll teach you about consequences." The crows remain unimpressed. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Formal education for peasant children essentially didn't exist in 15th century villages. The parish priest might teach a few promising boys basic Latin and reading, but that was reserved for potential clergy or the rare peasant child being groomed for something beyond agricultural labour. Girls were almost never educated formally. Everyone else learned through doing. You mastered ploughing by following your father, spinning by watching your mother, and bird scaring by being handed a sling and told to make yourself useful. Childhood as a distinct, protected phase of life wasn't really a concept yet. You were a baby, then a small child learning basic tasks. Then around age 7 you started doing actual productive work, and by early teens you were handling full adult responsibilities. The idea that children should play freely and not work, that children need specialized education and development time, those are modern concepts that would baffle medieval people who needed every family member contributing to survival. Your daughter, the one currently carrying the baby on her hip back at Homie's, actually doing relatively skilled work. Yes, she's 10. Yes, she's managing an infant while also being expected to help with cooking, spinning, cleaning, and whatever other tasks arise. This is normal. By age 10, medieval girls were miniature adults in terms of household responsibilities, lacking only the physical strength for the heaviest tasks. Some children have even more demanding jobs. There's a group of kids near the forest edge gathering kindling small sticks and fallen branches that will become the fuel that keeps household fires going. This requires walking into the woods, which carries genuine dangers. Wolves still exist in 15th century Europe, though they mostly avoid humans. Wild boars are aggressive and can injure or kill a child. Simply getting lost in unfamiliar forest is a real risk. But firewood is essential, and gathering kindling is considered safe enough for children if they work in groups. So off they go, 8-year-olds venturing into the trees, dragging back bundles of sticks that are often as big as they are. Nobody worries much about supervision because there isn't anyone available to provide it all. The adults are busy with their own labour. Your son gives up on the sling and starts throwing rocks directly at the crows. His aim is terrible, but his enthusiasm is admirable. One stone gets close enough that the crows actually relocate to a different section of the field, which he counts as a major victory. He's been at this since mid-morning, and his stomach is making pointed observations about missing lunch. Medieval children didn't get special kid food or multiple meals on demand. They ate when the adults ate, what the adults ate, and in smaller portions. If the household is low on food, children get even less. The phrase, "children should be seen and not heard," originated in medieval Europe, along with various other sayings that essentially communicate your needs are secondary to survival logistics. Historians still argue whether medieval parents loved their children the way modern parents do, or if high childhood mortality made emotional attachment too risky. Some scholars point to art, literature, and legal records showing clear parental grief over lost children as evidence of genuine affection. Others argue that the practical demands of medieval life left little room for the kind of focused parenting modern culture expects. The truth is probably complicated. Parents loved their children, but also couldn't afford to let that love interfere with the harsh realities of agricultural survival. A younger child, maybe 5 years old, appears at the field edge carrying a small basket. She's been sent to collect eggs from the chickens, which is an entry-level job that requires remembering where the chickens tend to nest and not dropping the eggs on the way back. She's taking her responsibilities very seriously, walking with exaggerated care, tongue sticking out in concentration. Your son watches her pass and feels temporarily superior because at least he's doing harder work than egg collection. Never mind that he's currently being outsmarted by birds she's older and therefore more valuable, or at least that's what he tells himself. The quirky reality about medieval childhood, children were expected to work, but they also found ways to play. Games existed. Medieval kids played with dolls, toy weapons, balls made from inflated pig bladders, and improvised toys from sticks and stones. They had singing games and chasing games and complicated make-believe scenarios. But play happened around and between work, not instead of it. You'd scare birds for 3 hours, then play at being knights for 20 minutes before being called to help with something else. Some children were apprenticed out to craftsmen or sent to work in larger households as servants. This could happen as young as age 7 or 8. You'd be sent to learn a trade or serve in a noble household, living away from your family, doing whatever work your master assigned. It was considered good fortune if you got placed with a skilled craftsman who might actually teach you something valuable. Less fortunate placements meant years of menial labour with minimal training. Your son has returned to rock throwing with renewed determination. A crow has made the mistake of landing close to his position, and he's stalking it like the world's least effective predator. The crow watches his approach with one eye, decides he's not a threat, and continues pecking at seeds. Your son throws. The crow dodges casually. This dance continues. In a few years, your son will graduate from bird scaring to actual field work. He'll learn to guide the plough, plant seeds, harvest grain, and all the other agricultural tasks that will define his entire life. He'll develop the back problems, the calluses, the resigned acceptance of endless manual labour that characterises adult medieval peasant existence. But for now, he's 7, and his main job is harassing crows, which is at least slightly less soul-crushing than the alternative. The afternoon sun continues its slow arc. The crows continue their raids. The children continue their losing battle against avian grain theft. And somewhere in the distance, adults are doing the real work while trying not to think too hard about the fact that their children's futures are already determined more of the same forever, until death or dramatic social upheaval provides an exit. Welcome to medieval childhood, exactly as fun as it sounds, which is to say, not very. Late afternoon, and your strip is finally showing signs of completion. The weeds are mostly pulled, the soil is turned, and your back feels like it's been used as a medieval torture demonstration. You straighten up and look across the fields toward the manor house, which sits on the slight rise at the village's eastern edge, overlooking everything like a stone reminder of exactly who's in charge here. The manor house is the only building in the village that looks permanent and substantial. While your cottage is wattle and daub that needs constant repairs and will probably collapse in a generation or two, the manor is timber-framed on a stone foundation, with actual glass in some windows and a slate roof that doesn't leak every time it drizzles. The Lord doesn't live there full-time. He's got multiple estates and spends most of his year travelling between them, but the house represents his authority even in his absence. Around the manor house are the Lord's demesne landshires, personal fields that are separate from the common field system. Those fields are larger, better maintained, and worked primarily by peasant labour that you owe as feudal obligation. Looking at them now, you can see they've already been ploughed and planted, which makes sense because everyone's required labour got directed there first, before anyone could focus on their own strips. Here's the uncomfortable reality of your existence. You don't actually own your land. You hold it in a feudal arrangement where the Lord technically owns everything, the fields, the village, even the cottage you live in, and you're allowed to work that land in exchange for a staggering array of payments, services, and obligations that consume somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of everything you produce. Let's catalogue some of what you owe, just for fun. First, there's labour service on the demesne owe the Lord a certain number of days per year working his fields instead of yours. The reeve mentioned 3 days during wheat harvest and 4 during barley, but that's just harvest. You also owe ploughing days, weeding days, maintenance days on the manor buildings, and special extra days whenever the Lord decides he needs additional labour for projects like building that new mill or repairing the manor's roof. Then there's rent, which you pay in grain. A portion of your harvest goes directly to the Lord, calculated by strip size and field quality. This isn't negotiable. The bailiff will literally measure your harvest and take his portion, and if you try to hide grain or underreport yields, you're risking serious legal consequences. On top of that, you pay fees for using the Lord's facilities. Want to grind your grain at the mill? That's a fee, and remember you're legally required to use the Lord's mill, no alternatives allowed. Need to bake bread in the communal oven? Another fee. Want to press apples for cider? The Lord owns the press, so that's yet another fee. It's like a medieval subscription service, except you can't cancel, and the only benefit is not starving. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The marriage tax, called merché, was a real thing that actually existed. If you wanted to marry, or more specifically, if you wanted to marry your daughter to someone outside the manor's lands, you needed the Lord's permission and had to pay a fee. The Lord theoretically had the right to approve or deny marriages among his peasants, though in practice this was mostly just another revenue stream. Some manors also had leerwite, a fine for sexual relations outside marriage, because apparently the Lord needed to monetize literally everything, including your personal relationships. There's also hiriot, which is the fee your family owes when you die. Upon death, your best animal, usually your ox or cow, gets claimed by the Lord as a death tax before your heirs can inherit anything. So not only do you work your entire life paying fees to the Lord, but even in death you're making one final contribution to his wealth while your family loses their most valuable asset. Historians still argue whether feudalism was a system of mutual obligation with genuine protections for peasants, or just formalized exploitation with extra steps. Some scholars point out that lords were supposed to provide military protection, justice administration, and famine relief in exchange for peasant labor. Others note that lords frequently failed to uphold these obligations while still demanding full payment, and peasants had essentially no recourse when the system failed them. The bailiff lives in a smaller building near the manor house. You can see smoke rising from his chimney right now. He's probably inside reviewing his accounts, planning next week's inspection tour, calculating exactly how much he can extract from the village without quite triggering mass starvation. Bailiffs were professional estate managers, often literate and numerate, drawn from the minor gentry or wealthy peasant families, and compensated well enough that they had genuine incentive to maximize the Lord's revenue. Your relationship with the manor system is complicated. On one hand, you resent every fee, every day of labor service, every portion of harvest that disappears into the Lord's granaries. On the other hand, this is the only system you've ever known, and it does provide some stability. The Lord maintains the mill and the oven. His courts settle disputes when neighbors can't work things out. In theory, he'd provide protection if bandits or enemy armies showed up, though you've never actually tested that particular promise. The quirky reality, some manors had such complex fee structures that they required written records to track everything. Manorial court rolls from this period list dozens of different obligations: wood penny for collecting firewood, pannage for pasturing pigs in the Lord's forest, tallage as a general tax that could be levied whenever the Lord needed cash, and various other creatively named ways to transfer wealth upward. Reading these records, you get the sense that medieval lords and their administrators spent considerable time inventing new fees just to see what they could get away with. You also need permission for things that seem absurdly personal. Want to send your son to learn a trade in the next town? Need permission and possibly a fee. Want to clear some forest to expand your fields? That's the Lord's forest, so permission and fee. One time, there was even a case in a neighbouring manor where the Lord tried to charge a fee for peasants leaving the village temporarily to visit relatives. The court struck that one down, but the fact that it was attempted tells you something about the system's logic. The manor house bell rings not a church bell, but the manor's own bell used to summon peasants for announcements or labour obligations. You tense slightly, wondering what fresh demand is about to be announced. But it's just the end of workday bell, signalling that the Demesne labour crews can finish up. That doesn't mean you can stop working your own. Strips you'll keep going until sunset, but at least nobody's getting summoned for emergency manor service right now. You look back at the manor house, sitting up there in its stone foundation glory, and try not to think too hard about the fundamental injustice of a system where you work yourself into an early grave so that some guy who was born into the right family can live in comfort. That way lies dangerous thoughts, the kind that could get you labelled a troublemaker. Besides, what are you going to do, revolt? Overthrow the feudal system? That definitely won't happen for at least another century or 3, and even then, it'll be complicated and messy and not actually solve everything. For now, you're stuck with this arrangement. Work the land, pay the fees, fulfill your obligations, and hope the Lord's relatively benign neglect continues, because his active attention is always worse. Just another day in paradise, feudal edition. At least the sun will set eventually, and you can stop thinking about how much of your labor belongs to someone else. Tomorrow you can wake up and do it all again, secure in the knowledge that this system will definitely last forever and nothing will ever change. Probably. As the sun starts its descent toward the western horizon, you hear the distant sound of bells, not church bells this time, but the lighter tinkling of bells attached to livestock. This is the signal that the village's communal animals are being rounded up from their daily foraging and driven back toward the village for the night. You set down your tools and head toward the forest edge where the herding is happening. This is one of those communal tasks that requires multiple people and happens daily, a weird mix of cooperation and chaos that somehow keeps the village's livestock alive despite everyone's best efforts to lose track of various animals. The village herd is a motley collection of species that would make modern farmers question your organizational skills. There are maybe 20 sheep, all supposedly owned by different families, but functionally managed as one flock. A dozen or so pigs of varying sizes, from piglets to one massive sow that everyone swears is possessed by demons. Several goats, including Thomas's suspiciously nice new one. A gaggle of geese that serve as the world's most aggressive alarm system. And a handful of cows that got driven out this morning to graze the fallow field and forest edges. Keeping track of which animal belongs to whom is surprisingly complicated. Most animals have some form of marking gear notches for pigs, paint marks on sheep's wool, bells of different tones for the more valuable animals. But markings fade, bells fall off, and honestly after a full day of animals wandering around intermingling, nobody's entirely sure they're bringing home exactly the right pig every night. You join William, Agnes, and several others who've gathered at the forest edge. The village swineherd, that's Thomas's teenage nephew, who drew this particular short straw for the season. He's trying to organize the pigs into something resembling a group. The pigs have other ideas. Pigs are simultaneously intelligent and stubborn, which makes herding them like trying to organize a committee of small, food-motivated anarchists. "Come on, you demons," the boy yells, waving a stick at a particularly recalcitrant pig who's decided that this oak tree is more interesting than going home. The pig grunts derisively and continues rooting in the undergrowth for acorns. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Pigs were among the most valuable livestock in medieval villages because they could forage in forests for acorns, beechnuts, and roots, converting woodland resources into meat without requiring precious grain. Forest, writes the ability to pasture pigs in the Lord's forest were jealously guarded privileges, and villagers paid fees for pannage, the right to let pigs feed in the woods during autumn when nuts were falling. The sheep are easier to manage because they naturally flock together, responding to each other's movements with that herd mentality that makes them simultaneously easy to control and dangerously easy to lead into disasters. You help guide them by positioning yourself at the edge of the group, waving your arms to create a boundary they're reluctant to cross. The lead sheep, who everyone calls Big Tom for reasons lost to history, starts moving toward the village, and the rest follow automatically. Geese are escorting themselves, honking aggressively at anything that moves. Geese are technically livestock, but functionally operate as an independent militant force that tolerates human presence. They waddle along with the general migration toward the village, periodically stopping to hiss at threats both real and imagined. One particularly aggressive goose charges at William for the crime of existing, and he has to actually dodge out of the way. "I hate geese," William mutters. "Every single one of them is a tiny dinosaur with a personal vendetta." "Geese are good watch animals," Agnes points out, keeping pace with the sheep flock. "Better than dogs for warning about strangers." Geese are nightmares with feathers, William counters. The fact that they're useful doesn't make them less evil. Historians still argue whether medieval people had affectionate relationships with their livestock or viewed them purely as economic assets. Some records mention animals by name and describe genuine grief when valuable animals died. Others treat livestock deaths as simple financial losses, no different from broken tools. The truth is probably that it varied. Some people bonded with their animals, others stayed professionally distant, and everyone recognized that your cow or pig might eventually need to be slaughtered, so getting too attached was risky. The pigs are finally moving, more or less as a group. The swine herd has managed to get most of them pointed in the right direction through a combination of food bribery, hay scattering grain that he definitely skimmed from somewhere, and persistent yelling. Pigs are following the grain trail while also stopping constantly to investigate interesting smells, fight with each other, or just stand there contemplating pig philosophy. One piglet has gotten separated and is now running in panicked circles, squealing at a volume that seems physically impossible for something so small. Your daughter, who joined the herding party because she's old enough to help, scoops up the piglet, which immediately screams like it's being murdered. Pigs are dramatic creatures. They're worse than the children you observe watching the chaos. The children listen occasionally, Agnes replies. These animals have collectively decided that cooperation is for other species. The procession moves slowly toward the villager sheep flowing like a woolly river, pigs wandering in a vaguely forward direction, geese strutting with unearned confidence, and several humans trying to maintain order while questioning their life choices. It's genuinely absurd, this daily migration of livestock that probably looks pastoral and charming from a distance, but up close is just noise and animal smells and hoping nobody loses a pig in the chaos. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some medieval villages had official pig markers, whose job was to identify and record each household's pigs using unique Urnotch patterns. These patterns were kept in village records, and disputes over pig ownership could go to manorial court where the pig marker's testimony carried legal weight. Imagine being the guy whose entire professional identity can identify pigs by their ear notches. That's a real medieval occupation that actually existed. A cow decides this is the perfect moment to stop walking and start licking a fence post. Just stops mid-procession, completely blocking the path, tongue working methodically over weathered wood like this is the most important thing happening in the universe. You have to push against her flank, which is like pushing against a ferry boldet to get her moving again. The village buildings are visible now, smoke rising from evening fires as families start preparing supper. The animals recognize home territory and pick up the pace slightly. The sheep know their pen is nearby. The pigs can smell the swill buckets. Even the cow, who was deeply invested in the fence post, has remembered that the village means food and rest. You help guide the sheep into their communal pina-fenced area that's maintained by whoever's turn it is in the rotation of fence repair duties. The pigs get directed toward their separate enclosure. The geese scatter to their various homes because geese answer to no one and go where they please. The cows get led to the barn area where they'll be milked before settling in for the night. Your household's pig trots off towards your cottage, probably planning to immediately demand food despite having spent all day eating forest debris. Animals are like children in that regard, always hungry, constantly demanding, and somehow essential to survival despite being inconvenient. The sun is low now, painting everything in golden light that makes even the manure-streaked village look almost picturesque. Almost. The livestock are secured, which means one less thing to worry about until tomorrow when you'll do this exact same process in reverse, driving them back out to forage. Just another evening ritual in the endless cycle of medieval agricultural life. At least the animals made it home relatively intact, and nobody lost a pig to wolves or theft or the pig's own stupidity. Tomorrow's problems can be tomorrow's problems. For now, it's almost time for supper and the sweet relief of sitting down for the first time since dawn. Before you can even think about sitting down or eating, there are two more essential tasks that need completing before darkness falls completely: water and firewood. Because apparently your day of back-breaking labour wasn't quite complete without hauling heavy things around the village while your body stages a formal complaint. The village well is located in the central square, conveniently positioned to be maximally inconvenient for everyone. It's a stone-lined hole in the ground with a wooden bucket on a rope and a simple pulley system that's supposed to make drawing water easier, but mostly just makes you appreciate modern plumbing. The well is communal property, maintained collectively, and a source of constant low-level drama about who's using too much water or not maintaining the rope properly. You arrive with two wooden buckets, both showing their age through various repairs and patches. Other villagers are already there, waiting their turn in the informal queue that forms every evening. There's Margaret from 2 cottages over, there's the baker's wife looking as exhausted as you feel, there's a couple of teenage girls who've been sent on water duty and are treating it as an opportunity to gossip about whoever's not present. "Heard about Thomas's goat," one of the girls says, loud enough that it's clearly meant for public consumption. "Everyone's heard about Thomas's goat," her friend replies. At this point, the goat is more famous than Thomas. You wait your turn, trying not to think about how much your back hurts or how many trips you'll need to make to get enough water for the evening and tomorrow morning. Medieval households used surprising amounts of water for cooking, for drinking, for washing hands and faces, full bathing being a rare event, for livestock, for various cleaning tasks that accumulated throughout the day. And every single drop had to be hauled by hand from this one communal well. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval people were actually aware that water quality mattered for health, even without understanding germ theory. Wells were considered safer than streams or ponds, which everyone recognized as contaminated by upstream activities. Villagers protected their wells carefully, imposing fines on anyone who polluted them with waste or allowed animals to foul the area. The well you're standing next to represents considerable communal investment. Someone had to dig it, line it with stones, maintain it, and defend it from contamination. Your turn arrives. You lower the bucket into darkness, hearing it splash far below. The rope is rough against your palms, already calloused from field work, but still capable of new friction burns if you're careless. You haul the bucket up hand over hand, the weight increasing as it clears the water and becomes dead weight pulling against your tired arms. The first bucket comes up sloshing, water spilling over the sides because the bucket's not quite level and you're too exhausted for perfect technique. You pour it carefully into one of your own buckets, trying not to waste any water in the transfer. Lower the well bucket again. Haul it up again. Pour into your second bucket. Your shoulders are screaming. You're ignoring them. "Going for a third?" the baker's wife asks, because apparently she's keeping count. "Need it for the brewing," you explain, which is true, but also none of her business. Water politics in medieval villages could get surprisingly petty, people tracking who uses how much, who's wasteful, who takes more than their fair share during dry seasons. You make a third trip down the well. Now you've got 3 buckets of water, 2 you can carry simultaneously using a wooden yoke across your shoulders, and 1 that'll require a second trip. The yoke is a curved piece of wood designed to distribute the weight across your shoulders and neck, which helps but also creates its own pressure points that will ache later. You hoist the yoke into position, hang a bucket on each end, and start the walk back to your cottage. The weight is substantial. Water is heavy, roughly 8 pounds per gallon, and you're carrying multiple gallons, swashing against your legs as you walk. Every step requires balance and care because spilling water means making another trip to the well, and you absolutely don't have the energy for that. Historians still argue whether medieval people appreciated the sheer physical labor involved in basic daily survival, or if they were so accustomed to constant work that they didn't register it as unusual. Modern people doing historical reenactments often cite water hauling as one of the most surprisingly difficult aspects of medieval life. It's repetitive, heavy, endless, and utterly essential. You make it home, pour the water into your household storage barrel, and head back for the third bucket. By the time you've completed the water collection, the sun is noticeably lower and you're running out of daylight for the second essential task, firewood. Your family's firewood pile is always in some state of inadequacy. You burn through wood constantly for cooking, for heat, for basic light since candles are expensive. Winter fuel needs start accumulating in spring and continue all year because you can never have too much firewood, and running out in January means potentially freezing to death or going hungry because you can't cook. You grab a rope and head toward the edge of the village where the common wood gathering area is located. This is the designated zone where villagers can collect fallen branches and deadwood without technically poaching from the Lord's forest. Living trees belong to the Lord. Dead branches on the ground occupy a legal grey area that the village has negotiated access to, assuming you only take what's genuinely dead and already fallen. Other people are doing the same thing. You can see William ahead of you, bent over gathering sticks, moving with that slow care of someone whose back gave up hours ago but keeps working anyway. A cluster of children are also collecting kindling, competing to see who can gather the biggest bundle while still being able to carry it. The work is straightforward but tedious. Walk around looking for fallen branches. Pick them up, bundle them together. Repeat until you've got enough wood to justify hauling it back. The rope gets used to tie the bundle together into something transportable, which requires a special knot that your father taught you and you'll teach your son, passing down essential knowledge about securing firewood bundles across generations. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some medieval communities had elaborate rules about firewood collection, specifying exactly what could be taken and when. By hook or by crook is actually a phrase from medieval forest law, referring to using a hook or a crook shepherd's staff to pull down dead branches without damaging living trees. You could take what you could reach with these tools, but climbing trees or cutting living wood was illegal and could result in serious fines. You're gathering smaller sticks now, the kind that work for kindling and quick cooking fires. Larger logs are rarer and more valuable. You save those for longer burning fires on cold nights or for baking days when you need sustained heat. The bundle is growing and your back is providing detailed feedback about its opinions on bending over repeatedly after a full day of agricultural labor. The sun touches the horizon. Time to head back. You hoist the firewood bundle onto your shoulder, feeling the weight settle in alongside all the other accumulated aches and pains. The walk back to your cottage feels longer than it should, even though it's maybe 5 minutes total. Your firewood pile gets one bundle larger. Your water barrel is full. The essential evening tasks are complete, which means you can finally focus on the exciting activities of eating supper and collapsing into unconsciousness. Just another day in medieval paradise, where even getting water and fuel requires enough physical labor to qualify as a workout by modern standards. Tomorrow you'll use this water and burn some of this wood, and then you'll do it all, again hauling buckets, gathering sticks, maintaining the endless cycle of resource collection that keeps medieval life functioning. It never ends. The water always runs out. The firewood always gets used. And you always have to go get more. At least the sunset is pretty. You'll give medieval life that much. When you're too exhausted to think anymore, the sky puts on a decent show. Back at the cottage, Margaret has been working her own magic with limited ingredients, which is to say she's made more pottage because that's what medieval supper looks like 90% of the time. The pot hanging over the fire contains a thicker version of this morning's breakfast, same base of oats and water, but this time enriched with some beans that have been soaking since yesterday, those onions from the garden, and if you're very lucky, a small piece of salted pork that's been hanging from the rafters since last autumn's pig slaughter. The cottage is filling with smoke, and cooking smells in roughly equal measure. The fire is burning well. Margaret fed it with some of the firewood you just hauled in, and the smoke is mostly finding its way out through the roof hole, though enough lingers inside to make your eyes water. You've lived with constant smoke your entire life, so you barely notice anymore. But your lungs definitely notice and will remind you about it when you're older and struggling to breathe. The family is gathering around the hearth because that's where everything happens in a medieval cottage. The hearth isn't just for cooking, it's your heat source, your light source, your social centre, and basically the reason your house doesn't count as outdoors. Everything revolves around this fire, literally and figuratively. You settle onto the floor near the warmth, legs stretched out, feeling every muscle protest the transition from standing to sitting. Your son is already there, looking as exhausted as a 7-year-old can look after a day of fighting birds. Your daughter is still managing the baby, who's fussy and probably hungry and adding to the general noise level. Margaret is stirring the pot with a long wooden spoon, checking the consistency and occasionally tasting to see if it needs. Well, it needs salt and spices, but since you don't have those, she's checking if it needs more water or more cooking time. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The hearth fire in medieval homes was kept burning continuously when possible, because relighting it was genuinely difficult without matches or lighters. You had to use flint and steel to create sparks, catch those sparks in tinder-dried fungus or charred cloth, nurse the tiny ember into a flame, and build that flame into actual fire. The whole process could take 15 minutes or longer, so letting your fire go out was something you tried to avoid. The meal is ready, or at least ready enough. Margaret ladles pottage into wooden bowls. You have 4 bowls for 6 people, so some sharing is involved. The baby doesn't get a bowl because babies don't get bowls. They get pre-chewed food from their mother or soft bread soaked in liquid. Medieval childcare was not precious about these things. You receive your bowl and a wooden spoon worn smooth from years of use. The pottage is hot, which is genuinely pleasant after a long day. It's thick enough to stay on the spoon, but thin enough to be called stew rather than just cooked grain. The beans add some texture and protein. The pork there's maybe an ounce in your portion adds a hint of salt and fat that makes everything taste better. The onions have cooked down into soft, sweet pieces that break apart on your tongue. It's not gourmet cuisine. It's not even particularly flavorful by modern standards, but it's hot, filling, and after burning thousands of calories through manual labor, your body doesn't care about culinary sophistication. This is fuel, and you're grateful for it. The family eats mostly in silence. Conversation happens, but it's minimal. Someone mentions that the cows seem to be limping slightly. Someone else notes that the thatch on the cottage's east side is looking questionable and might need attention soon. Your daughter reports that the chickens laid 3 eggs today, which is actually good news since they've been underperforming lately. Nobody's discussing philosophy or politics or anything deep. Medieval peasant families at the end of a workday aren't having extended dinner conversations about the meaning of life. They're eating, managing children, and trying not to fall asleep in their pottage. Historians still argue whether medieval families were emotionally close in the way modern families are, or if the brutal demands of survival left little room for the kind of emotional intimacy that modern culture values. Some evidence suggests genuine family bonds, wills leaving property to beloved spouses, court records showing families defending each other, letters expressing affection. Other evidence suggests more transactional relationships where family members were valued primarily for their labor contributions. The truth is probably that it varied by family and individual, just like it does now. Your son is falling asleep with his spoon halfway to his mouth. The kids spend all day running around fields yelling at birds, and his tiny body has hit its limit. Margaret gently removes the spoon from his hand and sets aside his half-finished bowl. He'll get the leftovers tomorrow if he's hungry. For now, sleep is more important than forcing him to finish every bite. The quirky reality about medieval mealtimes, families didn't necessarily eat together at a table like modern dinner scenes. Tables were expensive furniture that many peasant households didn't own. You ate sitting on the floor near the fire, or on a bench if you had one, or standing up, or wherever was convenient. The idea of a formal family dinner with everyone seated at a table in assigned spots is largely a modern middle-class invention. The baby is crying again, that continuous low-grade crying that babies do when they're tired and overstimulated and generally done with consciousness. Margaret shifts the baby to her other hip while finishing her own pottage one-handed, demonstrating that maternal multitasking skill that transcends historical periods. You finish your portion and use a piece of bread to scrape the bowl clean. Nothing gets wasted. Every calorie matters. The bowl goes into the bucket near the door. It'll get rinsed with water tomorrow morning before being used for breakfast pottage, continuing the cycle of wooden bowls serving endless variations of grain-based meals. The fire is burning lower now. Margaret adds another log, settling it carefully to maintain heat through the evening and hopefully keep enough coals alive to restart easily tomorrow. Fire management is one of those domestic skills that seems simple until you try it, keeping flames going without using too much fuel, maintaining heat without creating a blaze that's dangerous in a thatch-roofed cottage. Your daughter is still awake, curled up near the fire with some scraps of wool she's practicing, spinning on a small drop spindle. She's not very good. The thread is lumpy and uneven, but she's learning, and eventually this skill will be automatic enough that she can spin while walking, while talking, while doing basically anything that doesn't require both hands. The cottage is warm from the fire and the press of bodies. Outside, you can hear the village settling into night occasional voices. A dog barking somewhere, the distant complaint of a goose who's apparently not ready for bed. The chickens have already roosted in their corner of the cottage, occasionally making soft chicken sounds that blend into the background noise. There's something almost peaceful about this moment, even though you're exhausted and sore and facing exactly the same routine tomorrow. The family is fed. The fire is warm. Everyone's relatively intact after another day of medieval survival. The bar for good evening is remarkably low, and yet this qualifies. Margaret is working on some small repair task, mending a tear in someone's tunic by firelight, her needle moving with practiced efficiency even in dim conditions. Medieval people did a shocking amount of detail, work by firelight or candlelight that would strain modern eyes. Your vision just adapted, or you went blind, or you learned to work by touch and limited visibility. You leaned back against the cottage wall, feeling the wattle and daub rough against your shoulders. In a bit, you'll need to get up and do various bedtime tasks, checking that the animals are secure, making sure the fire is properly banked, maybe stepping outside for a final bathroom trip because chamber pots exist but are unpleasant. But for now, you're just sitting, warm, fed, surrounded by family, too tired to do anything but exist in this moment. Tomorrow will bring more fieldwork, more obligations, more endless labour. Tonight, you've got a full belly and a warm fire, and by medieval standards, that's actually a pretty good evening. You've barely settled into comfortable exhaustion when there's a knock at the door. Well, knock is generous. It's more like someone tapping on the door frame, since your door is just a piece of wood hanging on leather hinges that doesn't quite close properly anyway. Medieval privacy is mostly theoretical. "Ale!" a voice calls from outside. It's John, your field-working companion, probably with a few others in tow. Margaret sighs, but not in an unfriendly way. Evening visitors are normal, expected even, and refusing hospitality would be noted and remembered by the village social network. She gestures toward the ale barrel in the corner. "There's enough." John enters along with Agnes and William, the old-timer, who's apparently not too exhausted from fieldwork to make social calls. They bring the cold evening air with them, and the smell of other people's hearth smoke, different from your own smoke, but equally pervasive. "Thought you might want company," John says, settling onto the floor near the fire without waiting for invitation. This is how medieval visiting works. You show up, you sit down, you participate in whatever's happening. Formal invitations aren't really a thing. Margaret pours ale into cups, a mix of wooden and clay vessels that represent your household's entire drinkware collection. The ale is from the batch she brewed 4 days ago, so it's at peak drinkability before it starts getting too sour. By medieval standards, this is actually decent ale, not the best, but far from the worst. "How were the fields today?" William asks, accepting his cup with the careful grip of someone with arthritic hands. "Fields were fields," you reply. "Ploughing, weeding, existential dread." The usual. Here's your mainstream historical fact. These informal evening gatherings were called alabenches and served as the primary social institution in medieval villages. Without newspapers, without literacy, without any form of mass communication, village gossip was literally how information spread. Who was getting married, who owed whom money, what the Lord's latest demands were, which crops were failing all. Of this got transmitted through evening conversations over weak ale. Heard the reeve confirm the extra harvest days, Agnes mentions, and everyone groans collectively. This is apparently the hot gossip. 7 days total, John confirms, because the Lord's daughter needs a fancy wedding. Could be worse, William offers. My grandfather told stories about when the old Lord's son got married and they demanded 10 days plus a special tax on every household. Your grandfather told stories about everything being worse in his day, Agnes points out. According to him, they used to plough uphill both ways through snow in summer. The group laughs, that tired laughter of people too exhausted for big reactions but appreciating the humour anyway. Medieval people definitely had senses of humour. Historical record is full of jokes, some of which are still funny and others that require significant cultural context to understand why anyone thought they were amusing. Speaking of the Lord, John leans forward conspiratorially, heard his bailiffs bringing someone new next week? An inspector from another estate who's going to review all the measurements and accounts. This causes concerned murmurs. An outside inspector suggests the Lord thinks his current bailiff might be skimming, or that revenue isn't meeting expectations. Either way, it means increased scrutiny on the village, more careful accounting, and probably attempts to extract additional value from peasants who barely have anything left to give. Fantastic, you mutter. Just what we needed. Just what we needed. More oversight. Could mean they find the bailiffs been cheating and we get relief, William suggests optimistically. When has noble administrative reform ever benefited us? Agnes asks reasonably. They'll find some discrepancy, decide we owe back taxes, and we'll be paying extra for the next 3 years. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants were politically aware or just focused on immediate survival. Some evidence suggests peasants had sophisticated understanding of legal rights and actively contested unfair treatment through manorial courts and appeals. Other evidence suggests most people just tried to keep their heads down and avoid attention. The conversation you're having now suggests it's complicated. People understand the system, resent it, but also feel largely powerless to change it. The conversation shifts to more immediate village drama. Thomas's goat situation gets another round of analysis. The consensus is definitely that he stole it. The question is from where and whether he'll face consequences. Apparently, the reeve asked Thomas directly about the goat's provenance, and Thomas claimed he got it in trade from a merchant passing through, which nobody believes because Thomas has nothing valuable enough to trade for a goat that nice. He's going to get caught, Agnes predicts. And then we'll all have to pay hire watch fees because the Lord will claim inadequate village supervision. Medieval collective punishment was a real thing. Villagers could be fined as a group for individual members' crimes, which created strong social pressure for conformity and tattling on your neighbours when they did anything questionable. Someone mentions that Father Benedict seemed unusually tired during this morning's service. This leads to speculation about whether the priest is ill, drunk, or just fed up with managing a parish full of peasants who barely understand Latin and only show up to church because they have to. He's probably just old, William offers. Man's been priest here for 20 years. That's enough to exhaust anyone. The baby has finally fallen asleep in Margaret's arms, and your son is fully unconscious in the corner, sprawled out with that complete abandonment that only children achieve. Your daughter is still awake but fading, her spinning practice abandoned as she stares into the fire with heavy-lidded eyes. Here's your quirky tidbit. Medieval people tracked time partially by the length and content of these evening gatherings. A la bench time was an informal measurementif. Something took 3 ales. It meant roughly the time it would take to drink 3 cups while socializing, maybe an hour or 90 minutes. It's charmingly imprecise, but everyone understood it, and it worked better than trying to track actual hours when most people didn't own timepieces. The conversation is winding down now. Everyone's exhausted, the ale is running low, and there's that collective sense that it's time to head home before full darkness makes navigation difficult. The village has no streetlights, obviously, and while moonlight helps when available, walking around in complete darkness is an invitation to trip over something or step in something worse. John stands first, stretching with audible joint pops. Same time tomorrow? Fields aren't going anywhere, you confirm. Agnes and William follow him toward the door, thanking Margaret for the ale in that formulaic politeness that medieval people definitely practiced. Social niceties existed, even when everyone was too tired to mean them deeply. The cottage feels quieter after they leave, just your immediate family and the fire crackling softly. The evening visitors have fulfilled their social function, information has been exchanged, village bonds maintained, and everyone reminded that they're part of a community, for better or worse. Margaret is banking the fire now, covering the coals with ash to preserve them through the night. You help by making sure the door is properly secured, or as secure as a medieval door can be, which is vaguely closed rather than actually locked. Just another evening in the village where weak ale and tired gossip serve as both entertainment and social infrastructure. Tomorrow you'll hear more rumours, discuss the same problems, and drink more ale while collectively managing the shared challenges of medieval survival. The church bells ring again this time for Compline, the final canonical hour of the day. It's full dark now, proper nighttime darkness that modern people almost never experience. No streetlights, no neighbours' porch lights, no distant glow of a city on the horizon. Just black, punctuated by scattered firelight from cottage windows and the occasional torch if someone's wealthy enough to burn that kind of resource. You're exhausted. Your family is exhausted. The rational part of your brain suggests that maybe skipping Compline wouldn't be the worst idea. God probably understands about backbreaking agricultural labour and its impact on evening church attendance. But the social pressure is real. People notice who shows up and who doesn't, and being labelled as someone who skips services is the kind of reputation that follows you. "We going?" Margaret asks, already knowing the answer but asking anyway. "Might as well," you reply, because what's one more obligation at the end of a day defined by obligations? Your son is completely unconscious and stays that way. Your daughter is also asleep now, curled near the fire. The baby has achieved that rare state of infant peace. Margaret decides to stay with the sleeping children rather than drag them to church, which is both practical and gives her a legitimate excuse for absence. Women with small children get slightly more leeway on church attendance, one of the few areas where medieval society acknowledges that constant reproduction might interfere with other duties. You step outside into darkness so complete, it takes a moment for your eyes to adjust. Other villagers are emerging from their cottages, moving toward the church like slow moths drawn to the promise of candlelight. Nobody's moving quickly. Everyone's tired. This is obligation, not enthusiasm. The path to church is familiar enough that you can walk it mostly by feel and memory. Your feet know where the ruts are, where the ground slopes, where Thomas never quite filled in that hole from last month. Other people are visible as moving shadows, occasionally backlit by the fire glow from an open door. The church is the only building with proper lighting. Candles flicker in the window snot, many, because candles are expensive, but enough to make the stone building visible from across the village. It's almost welcoming, in a come fulfill your religious obligations kind of way. Inside, the church is dim and atmospheric. Maybe a dozen candles are burning, creating pools of yellow light that don't quite reach the corners. The stone walls seem to absorb the light, and the high ceiling disappears into shadow. The temperature is roughly the same as outside, which is to say cold, but at least you're out of any wind. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Compline was specifically designed as the final prayer service before sleep, with texts focusing on protection through the night, confession of daily sins, and preparation for death, since medieval people were very aware that any sleep might be your last. The service was deliberately calming, using psalms about nighttime safety and God's watchfulness, which makes it the medieval equivalent of a guided meditation, assuming your meditation includes significant Latin and kneeling on cold stone. The attendance is sparse, maybe 20 people out of a village of 150. Father Benedict doesn't comment on the low turnout. He's tired too, and honestly, getting anyone to show up for a fourth church service in a single day is pretty impressive by any standard. You find a spot along the wall and lower yourself to kneeling position, feeling your knees protest against the stone floor. The posture is familiar enough that your body settles into it automatically, even while complaining through various aches and pains. Father Benedict begins the service in Latin. The words wash over you in their familiar incomprehensibility. You know the responses phonetically. You've been mumbling these same sounds since childhood, but you couldn't translate a single phrase if your life depended on it. Telusis ante terminum, Father Benedict intones. The congregation responds with something that's supposed to be Latin, but comes out more like tired mumbling with vaguely Latin-shaped sounds. Close enough. God probably grades on a curve. The service has a drowsy quality that's genuinely peaceful after the day's intensity. The candlelight flickers hypnotically. The Latin creates a rhythmic background that doesn't demand comprehension. The stone church holds a kind of ancient stillness that feels separate from the daily grind of survival. You catch yourself nodding off and jerk awake. This is not uncommon. Historians still argue whether medieval people were genuinely spiritually moved by church services or just going through motions while half asleep. The answer is probably both, simultaneously, and varies by individual and day, and how tired you are and whether you've eaten enough. There's something comforting about the ritual repetition. The same prayers every night, the same psalms, the same progression through the canonical hours. It provides structure to time, anchors to the day, markers that exist outside the agricultural cycle of planting and harvest. The church bells ring, you show up, you mumble Latin, you're reminded that there's supposedly something beyond just dirt and grain and feudal obligations. Father Benedict is doing the blessing now, making the sign of the cross over the sparse congregation. Most people have their eyes closed, some from devotion, others from exhaustion. William is definitely asleep. You can hear his distinctive snore echoing slightly off the stone walls. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some medieval churches had carved misericords, small ledgers on the underside of hinged choir seats that clergy could rest against while technically still standing during long services. The word literally means mercy, and they were decorated with carvings ranging from religious scenes to surprisingly rude jokes and satirical images of lazy monks. The church understood that even the devout got tired and provided ergonomic accommodations while maintaining the appearance of proper posture. The service concludes with final prayers for protection through the night. You recite an Ave Maria in that semi-conscious state where your mouth moves through memorized words while your brain is mostly elsewhere. Ave Maria, gratia plena, the words are worn smooth by repetition, like stones in a riverbed, requiring no thought to produce. Father Benedict dismisses everyone with a final blessing. People rise from kneeling with various groans and joint pops. Nobody lingers. The church empties quickly as everyone heads back to their cottages and the promise of sleep. The walk home is even darker than the walk to church. The moon hasn't risen yet, and clouds have moved in to block starlight. You navigate by memory and faith, hoping you're walking toward your cottage and not someone else's, though honestly at this point you're too tired to care much. Your cottage is still warm from the banked fire when you push through the door. Margaret is awake, or awake enough to acknowledge your return. The children are all sleeping in their various positions around the hearth. You've survived another day. You fulfilled your obligations to the Lord, to the church, to your family, to the endless demands of medieval agricultural life. Tomorrow you'll do it all again, but that's tomorrow's problem. For now, there's just the warm darkness of the cottage and the sweet prospect of horizontal unconsciousness. The church bells have rung their final time today. The village is settling into nighttime quiet. and you're about to join the collective sleep of a community too exhausted to do anything but surrender to rest. The bedtime routine is mercifully brief because nobody has the energy for elaborate preparations. You don't have a bathroom sink with toothbrush and toothpaste. Dental hygiene in the 15th century is maybe rinse your mouth with water if you remember, and hope your teeth last until you're 40. You don't have pajamas to change into because you only own 2 sets of clothes total, and you're sleeping in the same tunic you worked in all day because washing clothes is a major production that happens maybe once a month. What you do have is a straw mattress in the corner farthest from the door, shared by most of your family in a sleeping arrangement that would horrify modern people who value personal space. The mattress is basically a large sack stuffed with straw that's been compressed by bodies into a semi-flat surface with suspicious lumps. It smells like straw, sweat, and general medieval mustiness, but so does everything else, so your nose stopped registering it as unusual years ago. Margaret is already settling the children onto the sleeping platform. Your daughter arranges herself on one edge, the baby tucked against her in that protective positioning that keeps infants from rolling off or getting squashed. Your son is still unconscious from earlier, and Margaret just covers him with a blanket where he lies near the hearth hill, probably migrate to the mattress in the middle of the night when he gets cold or when someone steps on him. You lower yourself onto the straw mattress with a groan that's become your signature sound after age 30. Every joint protests. Your back makes concerning noises. The mattress compresses under your weight, and you can feel individual straw pieces poking through the linen, ticking in that familiar, uncomfortable but tolerable way. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval people didn't sleep through the night in one continuous block the way modern people try to. Instead, they practiced segmented sleep. A first sleep of 3 or 4 hours, then a wakeful period of an hour or 2 in the middle of the night, then a second sleep until dawn. During the wakeful period, people would pray, talk, tend fires, have sex, or just lie there thinking. This sleep pattern was so normal that literature from the period references first sleep and second sleep as commonly understood concepts. Margaret climbs onto the mattress beside you, settling into the depression her body has created over years of sleeping in the same position. The baby is between her and your daughter. You're on the outer edge, which means you're closest to the cold air, but also have the easiest access for getting up during the night. The blankets are rough wool, probably made from your own sheep's wool, that Margaret spent months processing into fabric. They're heavy and scratchy and not particularly clean because, again, washing large textiles is difficult and time-consuming. But they're warm, trapping body heat against the evening chill, and after a day of physical labor in spring weather, warmth is all that matters. Your son makes a sleepy noise and crawls over to the mattress, wedging himself between you and the wall. Now, you're officially at capacity 2 adults, 3 children, all pressed together in a space that modern fire codes would never approve. Privacy doesn't exist. Personal space is a luxury for nobility. You sleep in a warm pile of family members and try not to elbow anyone in the face when you roll over. The fire is dying in the hearth, just glowing embers now that Margaret banked before climbing into bed. The cottage is getting darker as the last flames flicker and fade. Soon, it'll be completely black inside that absolute darkness that makes you understand why medieval people were genuinely afraid of night. Yeah. Outside, you can hear the village settling. A dog barks somewhere, probably at nothing. Someone's shutters bang in the wind because someone didn't secure them properly. The distant sound of the stream running past the mill creates a soft background noise that's been constant your entire life. Historians still argue whether medieval people were afraid of the dark or just pragmatically cautious about nighttime dangers. Certainly, night brought real risks. Fires could start. Thieves could operate under cover of darkness. Wild animals occasionally ventured close to villages. But the dark was also just a fact of life, the inevitable result of sunset in a world without artificial lighting. Your mind is already drifting, that transition state between waking and sleeping where thoughts become less linear and more dreamlike. You're mentally cataloguing tomorrow's tasks. That strip still needs finishing. The ploughshare needs picking up from the blacksmith. Someone should check the chicken who's been acting strange. But the thoughts are losing coherence, sliding into the fuzzy territory of almost dreams. Margaret shifts beside you, finding a more comfortable position. The baby makes small sleeping sounds. Your daughter is breathing with the deep regularity of genuine sleep. Your son has somehow rotated 90 degrees and his feet are now digging into your ribs, but you're too tired to care. The straw mattress rustles with every movement. The blankets smell like lanolin and unwashed wool. The cottage is full of the normal nighttime sounds, the fire's quiet crackling, the thatch roof settling, the mice that live in your walls going about their mouse business. Medieval people shared their homes with vermin as an accepted fact of life. Mice, rats, various insects. They're all just roommates you didn't invite but can't evict. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some medieval people believed in nightmares, literally evil spirits or demons that sat on your chest while you slept and caused bad dreams or breathing difficulties. What they were probably experiencing was sleep paralysis, a well-documented phenomenon where you wake up temporarily unable to move. But without modern medical knowledge, demons sitting on chest was a reasonable explanation for the sensation of pressure and inability to breathe while conscious but paralyzed. You're fading now, consciousness slipping away degree by degree. The day's labor has thoroughly exhausted your body, and sleep is claiming you whether you're ready or not. Your last semi-coherent thought is something about needing to check that field boundary tomorrow, or maybe it's about the chicken, or possibly you're already dreaming and just don't realize it yet. The darkness is complete now. The fire has died to bare embers. The cottage is just a warm pocket of family and straw and rough blankets in the greater darkness of night. You're asleep before you even realize you've crossed the threshold, your body surrendering to the exhaustion of another day survived in 15th century agricultural life. Tomorrow will bring more of the same, but that's tomorrow. Tonight, you're unconscious, and that's blessing enough. Deep in the night, you wake. Not because of an alarm or any external disturbance. Medieval people don't have those luxuries, but because your body has completed its first sleep cycle and is entering that middle-of-the-night wakeful period that would baffle modern sleep scientists if they didn't know about segmented sleep patterns. The cottage is absolutely dark. Not dim or low light, genuinely, completely dark in a way that modern people almost never experience. The fire has died to nothing, not even embers glowing anymore. There's no moon visible through the smoke hole. Your eyes are open, but they're providing exactly zero useful information because there's simply nothing to see. You lie there in the darkness, pressed between sleeping family members, straw poking through the mattress in a dozen places, and just exist. This wakeful period isn't stressful or concerning. It's normal, expected, part of the natural rhythm of medieval sleep. Some people pray during this time. Others talk quietly with their spouses. Some get up to tend the fire or check on livestock or relieve themselves. You just lie there, thinking slow thoughts about nothing in particular. Your body aches in that deep muscle way that comes from sustained physical labor, but it's a familiar ache, almost comfortable in its normalcy. You've been sore after fieldwork your entire adult life. This is just what bodies feel like. Margaret stirs beside you, also awake. "Can't sleep," she whispers. "First sleep's done," you reply quietly, not wanting to wake the children. Medieval couples had conversations during this night time. Wakeful period historians have found references to it in letters, diaries, and literature. It was considered normal, even intimate time together, away from the demands of work and children, just quiet darkness and whispered words. "Think Thomas actually stole that goat?" Margaret asks, because apparently even in the middle of the night, village gossip finds a way. "Absolutely," you confirm. Question is whether anyone will prove it. Outside, the village is mostly quiet but not silent. You can hear other sounds of nighttime life, someone coughing in a nearby cottage, A baby crying somewhere, the church bells ringing once for some canonical hour you've lost track of. Dogs occasionally bark at shadows or actual threats. The world doesn't completely stop just because it's dark. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Night watchmen existed in larger medieval towns, men paid to walk the streets calling out the hours and watching for fires or criminals. Villages didn't usually have organized night watches, but communities were small enough that unusual noises would wake people and unusual activity would be noticed. Theft at night was difficult because medieval buildings didn't lock securely and people would hear you breaking in. You need to relieve yourself, which means leaving the warm pile of family and stepping into the cold darkness. Chamber pots exist, but they're unpleasant and need emptying anyway, so you might as well go outside now. You carefully extract yourself from the tangle of sleeping children and blankets, finding the edge of the mattress by feel. Your feet hit the dirt floor, and the temperature difference is immediate and unpleasant. The cottage has cooled significantly without the fire burning. You navigate to the door entirely by memory and touch 3 steps from the bed to the central hearth area, another 4 to the door, feeling along the wall to find the door frame. Your hands know this cottage's geography in complete darkness because you've lived here your entire married life. Outside is somehow less dark than inside. The clouds have cleared, and stars are visible in numbers that would shock modern people who've only seen city skies. The Milky Way is a bright smudge across the heavens. Actual darkness reveals actual stars, thousands of them, providing just enough light to see vague shapes and outlines. You take care of business behind the cottage in the designated area that's far enough from the well but close enough to not require a major journey. Medieval sanitation was surprisingly organized. People understood that waste and water sources needed separation, even without understanding the science of contamination. The night air is cold and fresh, cutting through the permanent smoke smell that clings to everything inside the cottage. You can smell the village wood smoke from banked fires, livestock in their pens, turned earth from the fields, the general medieval mixture that you'd never be able to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. Other cottages show faint signs of life. A candle flickers in one. Window someone else is awake during this between-sleep time. You can hear muffled conversation from another cottage, voices too quiet to make out words, but audible in the nighttime stillness. Historians still argue whether medieval people felt safe at night or lived in constant fear of supernatural threats. Churches taught about demons and evil spirits. Folk beliefs added local monsters and malevolent fairies. But people also went about their nighttime business with apparent casualness, suggesting that whatever fear existed was manageable rather than paralyzing. You head back inside, navigating by touch and memory to find the mattress again. Margaret has already drifted back towards sleep, her breathing deep and regular. You settle back onto the straw, pulling the wool blankets over yourself, feeling your body temperature slowly recover from the cold night air. The children are all deeply asleep, arranged in their chaotic kid pile across the sleeping platform. Your son has somehow rotated completely and is now perpendicular to everyone else. The baby is snoring softly, that tiny congested snore that babies make. Your daughter hasn't moved at all, sleeping with the stillness of exhaustion. You close your eyes, even though it makes no difference in the complete darkness. Your breathing slows. The familiar aches and pains of your medieval body fade back into background awareness. Sleep is coming for the second time tonight, pulling you down into unconsciousness where you'll remain until the roosters crow and the church bells ring and another identical day begins. But for now, in this quiet darkness between the first sleep and the second, you exist in a space outside the usual demands of medieval life. No lord requiring labour, no fields demanding attention, no obligations pressing down, just the peaceful darkness, the warmth of family, and the deep stillness of a village at rest. Your breathing synchronizes with Margaret's beside you, both of you settling into that slow rhythm that precedes deep sleep. The straw mattress has compressed into a familiar shape molded by countless nights of bodies seeking rest. The scratchy wool blankets have warmed from your body heat, creating a cocoon against the cold night air. Outside, the village dreams its collective dreams. Fields lie quiet under starlight, waiting for tomorrow's labour. Animals rest in their pens and barns, warm and safe from nighttime predators. The church stands silent, its bells temporarily stilled until the next canonical hour calls the faithful to prayer. The stream continues its endless flow past the mill, that constant sound that's been background music to your entire life. The forest beyond the fields holds its own mysteries, but they're familiar mysteries now, part of the landscape you've known since childhood. Even the darkness feels gentle, protective rather than threatening. Your thoughts are becoming softer now, less distinct, blending into the edge of sleep where conscious awareness fades into something deeper and more restful. The day's worries about harvests and obligations and feudal demands drift away, becoming distant and unimportant. Tomorrow will come with all its challenges and repetitions, but tomorrow is far away. For now, there's only this: warmth, darkness, family, and the sweet descent into the second sleep that will carry you through until dawn. Your body knows this rhythm, has practiced it every night of your life. Rest comes easily to those who labor hard, and you've certainly earned this peaceful surrender to sleep. The last thing you're aware of is the gentle weight of the blankets, the soft breathing of your children, and the deep, encompassing quiet of a medieval night settling over everything like a benediction. And then even that awareness fades, and there's only sleep, deep and dreamless and restorative, the kind of rest that makes tomorrow's labor possible. Sweet dreams, friend. The medieval world will still be there when you wake.